This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, a little bit of green on the screen here. We got the S&P up about 1/10 of 1%. NASDAQ up just fractionally about 8 points here. Keep an eye on that. Yields pretty steady here. 10-year Treasury off about 2 basis points. 4.36 on your 10-year note here. WTI crude oil stronger today, up 2.3%, $76.50 for WTI crude oil. It's all about supply and demand out there. And as we talked to Fernando Valle earlier from Bloomberg Intelligence, he says the demand just isn't there right now for the incremental barrel. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. World and national news with Amy Mars.
All right, thank you, Paul. The truce remains intact, but the Israeli military says 3 explosive devices were detonated adjacent to Israeli troops in 2 different locations in the northern Gaza Strip, violating the framework of the operational pause. Many are hoping the latest extension of that pause in the fighting between Israel and Hamas can lead to even more extensions. Bloomberg's Nancy Lyons with that part of the story.
Officials say the exchanges will only continue if Hamas is willing to keep releasing hostages. Dr. Ariel Cohen, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, tells Bloomberg Businessweek one problem is that Hamas is not the only one holding hostages in Gaza.
They treat hostages as a commodity. They buy them and sell them. There are criminal gangs and clans that take these hostages and resell them.
While Cohen agrees the pause is needed, he says Israel must still be given an opportunity to eradicate Hamas. In Washington, Nancy Lyons, Bloomberg Radio.
Former President Donald Trump is threatening to reopen the contentious fight over the Affordable Care Act after failing to repeal it while in the White House. He says he's seriously looking at alternatives to Obamacare if he does win a second term. Wendy Schiller is director of the Alfred Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy at Brown University and says history shows this could prove very difficult for Trump.
People get used to the idea of a program with benefits that are available to them. And once it's entrenched, that is very difficult to shake once people get used to it. And that's about a 6 to 10 year window, which we've now passed when it comes to Obamacare.
Wendy Schiller of Brown University. Hunter Biden has agreed to testify before the House Oversight Committee in a public hearing. The move is a response to a subpoena from Republicans investigating nearly every aspect of his business dealings as they pursue an impeachment inquiry into his father, President Biden. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg. Paul and Jess.
All right, Amy Mars, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Jess, will you explain to me what a 15-minute city is?
So this is a really interesting story from the Washington Post today. So if the U.S. wants more 15-minute cities, it should start in the suburbs. So this is something, if you look across the globe, that other cities, Paris, Sydney included, where they're trying to promise access to housing, shopping, schools, and jobs within just about a 15-minute walk or so. So you can do that, or by bike, transit ride. I believe this is in an effort to sort of cut down the driving. But those are some cities, especially in the U.S., though. You have Ann Arbor, Michigan, Cleveland trying to embrace this concept, while Portland's complete neighborhoods and Eugene's 20-minute living are putting their own spin on the idea over in Oregon. But of course, not surprisingly, this sort of 15-minute pushback, city pushback is actually inspired some fierce debate here and in this journey from urban planning circles and public areas to some falsely claiming it will imprison people with the 15-minute radius of their homes. So not everybody is jumping on board, but you do have some cities in the U.S. starting to do this.
Well, I did learn just from this article, throughout recorded human history, less than 5% of people lived in cities. But in the relative blink of an eye, this situation reversed. People began leaving the countryside in droves during the Industrial Revolution. By 2008, the urban population had eclipsed the rural one. The gap continues to widen. 70% of the world's population is expected to live in the cities by 2050. Did not know that.
That's amazing. And
right.
I'm just saying.
Right.
JT's over it.
Yeah, how many times have they made that prediction?
I don't know.
By the way, it takes me 15 minutes to go from 66th Street to 68th Street on 3rd Avenue.
So the Upper East Side is not going to be a 15-minute city?
Right. Forget it.
15-minute city. All right.
He's over it.
That might work for a lot of places, but not the island that is Manhattan. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller.
Why were the economists so wrong? What are the economists getting wrong?
Isn't this a slam dunk time to buy U.S. Treasuries?
Soft landing, hard landing, no landing. I don't know.
True. What the heck does that mean?
I don't know.
Breaking market news and insight from Bloomberg experts.
We're going to be in an environment with higher rates for longer.
The 5-day in-office work week is effectively dead.
It's definitely a good sign that we're not ready to land this economy just yet.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, coming up in this hour, we're going to talk private credit. There's a lot of talk about, is there a bubble in private credit?
$1.5 trillion corner of the market.
And I said, to answer this question, to get smarter, we have to talk to Randy Schwimmer. He's a co-head of senior lending at Churchill Asset Management. Probably 90% of what I know about private credit I've learned from this guy, so he's going to come in studio.
And you mentioned you want to do that in a prior life.
I know. If I come back, I'm coming back as a private credit guy. Brianne Lynch is going to join us to talk to us about the IPO market. She's head of market insight at Equities, and there might be some IPOs in 2024. The investment bankers could certainly use that. And then we're going to talk markets with Neil Hennessy Advisors, chief strategist. So we'll get some stock picks there. Let's kick this whole thing off with a Bloomberg Business Flash, Mr. John Tucker.
All right, guys, it has been a November to remember for stocks. I just got to use that line again. The S&P 500 now adding to its 8% gain this month, just barely, after the best 4-week run for the S&P 500 in 1 year, and the Nasdaq's best since early this year. Buyers could be exhausted at this point. S&P 500 just 5 points higher right now. That's up 0.1%. We're at 45.55 in the index. The Dow's up 108 points right now. That's getting a lift from high-flying Boeing, up about 2% after an analyst upgrade. And the NASDAQ 100 right now 10 points higher. Micron Technology, the laggard in the S&P 500. John Stolfus, meantime, at Oppenheimer, he remains bullish of equities.
This looks like the best opportunity here, not at this moment necessarily, but generally speaking, at this period in time on the timeline, this looks like a great time for investors in equities, and a good time when all of a sudden a bond issuer have to pay for the privilege of borrowing money so you can diversify.
And among the data today, Conference Board saying consumer confidence rose in November for the first time in 4 months. Also, home prices rising for an 8th month, setting a fresh record. You can blame or credit sparse property listings for that one. And we check the markets for you all day long, right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Jess and Paul.
Yes, sir. John Tucker, thank you very much. Jess Metten sitting in for Matt Miller, who's on paternity leave. They had little girl number 2.
Baby.
So congratulations to the Miller clan up there in
So
Westchester.
exciting.
Yep, filling out the estate up there in Westchester County. So Jess Metten and Paul Sweeney, we're here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. We're streaming live on YouTube, so just head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Radio, and that's where you'll find us. Again, a little bit of green on the screen. We'll take it. Carmen Reinke joins us. She follows the markets for Bloomberg News. Carmen, what are you looking at in today's market trading?
Yeah, so one of the top ones I'm looking at today is PDD Holdings, ticker PDD. This is ADRs of Pinduoduo. Shares up about 18% right now. The company reported revenue doubled in its latest quarter, which far exceeded expectations. The highlight was shopping app Temu, which offered more discounts to shoppers and also increased marketing to compete with Shein and Amazon. So those are both, big sort of like discount retailers, just retailers that people are really frequenting a lot. Sort of an interesting one after Black Friday and Cyber Monday. The next one that we're looking at is Micron. The laggard in the S&P 500 shares are down about 3.2% right now for ticker MU. So the company raised its outlook for adjusted revenue in the quarter, but it said that it expects higher adjusted operating expenses at a level that exceeded analyst expectations. So it looks like that is what is weighing on shares of that company today. Sort of on the flip side of the S&P 500, looking at Synchrony Financial, ticker SYN, up about 3%. It agreed to sell best Pets Best Insurance Services.
Pets Best Insurance.
That's a mouthful.
It is.
To a company called Poodle Holdings Inc.
No.
I know.
That's not a real thing, is it?
It is. It's a real thing. I couldn't resist. It
love
expects a record gain of about $750 million net tax on the sale. So we've talked about pets a lot this year. You know, consumers love them. We're spending a lot on them. So that was a fun one.
Yeah, it's interesting. Looking at Micron, like you were mentioning, ticker symbol MU, it's still up 50% year to date, but over on the stocks, it's down about 5%. So the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index that encompasses a lot of those chip makers, but still, I mean, that's up, if you look at year to date, up around 46, 47% after declining about 35, 36 last year.
Yep.
So chip makers still rebounding this year, but you're seeing Micron a little under pressure today.
What is American Axle and Manufacturing Holdings? I didn't know there was such a thing.
Yeah, well, it's down about 3.5%, ticker AXL. It's an auto parts manufacturer, supplier.
You still do that?
I guess they do, yeah. So that's down today after Bank of America cut the recommendation, saying there just aren't any positive catalysts for the stock until next year. It's also dealing with persistent plant issues and the impact of labor cost inflation from the strikes. GM, Ford, and Stellantis.
Based in Detroit, Michigan, 824 million market cap. So that's what they do. Let's see how the stock is done here. You just don't hear these names. When a name comes up that I haven't heard or traded before, I can come up. All right, $7 stock, down 10% year to date. 825 billion market cap. Boy, you pick out some good ones.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm from a GM town. You gotta
really? Where's that?
I grew up in Janesville, Wisconsin.
Janesville, Wisconsin. What's in Janesville? Where's Janesville? Give me. It's near
Southern Wisconsin. It's near Madison.
Okay.
And it was GM. Was there until 2008.
Interesting. Okay, very cool. Yeah, we used to have a GM in my town. Just outside of Trent, New Jersey. No mas. Okay, Carmen Reineke, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Carmen Reineke follows all the markets for us. All right, private credit. You know we love this topic. It's a big, growing market. What's your number?
Around $1.5 trillion.
Oh my goodness! And you know it's just been growing. I've been calling out that having seen a bunch of credit blowups back in my day, there's going to be something. There's no regulation of this market. Something's going to go wrong, and I keep saying it, but it keeps growing. And I'll tell you what, pretty much everything we know about the private credit business, we learned from Randy Schwimmer.
Yes.
He's a co-head of senior lending at Churchill Asset Management here in New York. Randy,
you said 90%.
Yep.
I have work to do.
Yes, exactly. I don't want to put all the blame on you, but talk to us about the growth of this business. This private credit business has been such a big growth story on Wall Street, really since the end of the great financial crisis. How concerned are you about the development of this market? Should investors and should regulators be concerned?
Well, and Jess is now part of the private credit posse. Right?
Yes, she is.
I am.
Great. Well, the timing of this is great. Thanks for having me on. Because what's happening is that, and I talked to someone on a podcast that we're doing recently that's coming out, I think, this week, about that exact question. Why are people so concerned, and why is this viewed as a bubble as opposed to natural growth of moving loans from the public banking sector into the non-regulated, which is what the regulators wanted? And he said, because it's new. It feels new. Mm-hmm. It's not public. These loans are not traded. These are middle market companies. And part of that is just getting educated in the asset class. You guys have been doing a great job in doing that and helping me get the word out. I think Mark Rowan Apollo pointed out the fact that it's really investor education, and the more education there is, the better that we look. But the fact of the matter is that this is actually a natural evolution away from traded assets where the banks were considered to be not healthy holders of these loans. And so the private credit market has responded to the immense amount of appetite because of so much of market volatility. These loans are untraded, and illiquid loans, as opposed to being a negative, are viewed as being positive to a lot of investors, institutional investors, who are looking to allocate to non-traded, non-volatile, less correlated assets. So the reason that the asset class has grown so much is because the investors are looking for alternatives to the 60-40 correlation, you know, the allocation model that we talked about. And at the end of the day, these are middle market loans. These are low risk, relatively low levered, fully secured with financial covenants. And so think of private credit as middle market lending for grown-ups, okay? Yep. It's very stable lending that is being now packaged in multiple funds, very diverse investor base, across many now thousands of investors who are investing in this asset class who have experience in other complicated asset classes such as real estate and private credit and public equities and fixed income. And so it's actually meeting a demand, and the demand is growing as more investors realize what an opportunity and benefit it is.
What is your investment approach for private credit, specifically for your clients? What do you advise them to do and how to have that exposure?
Yeah, so we're also very fortunate to be owned by a very large entity called TIAA, which is their holding company for Nuveen, which is a $1 trillion asset manager. And they have hundreds of billions of dollars in fixed income and public equities and real estate and municipal bonds. And what their investors are looking at, the same thing as our investors at Churchill are looking for, is the stability of returns. And so in a normal environment, a senior credit, we've talked about this, will get you kind of a 7% unlevered yield. In the current environment, which is why it's very attractive right now because rates are up, they're earning a 12% unlevered yield. And so when they look at the returns of 12% versus what they're getting in other markets, we're representing a lower risk profile. And so that's adding to the appetite that these investors are looking for. Now, in our case, we can offer them senior debt opportunities. We can offer them junior capital. We can offer them private equity. So we have a number of asset classes that we're also offering our private equity sponsors in terms of their financing options. So we're taking the same financing choices that we're giving our clients on the financing side to the investors on the investing side. And that's what makes the sort of nice balance, which I think as investors and frankly the media and regulators get to understand the asset class, you know, this is not fast money. This is money that investors are focusing on long-term assets with us, long-term liabilities, because these loans don't disappear tomorrow. They're not traded. And that kind of stability is really at a premium right now.
Who is a typical investor in one of your funds?
So, yeah, we don't really have typical investors. We have them from a broad array of types of investors. So we have pension plans, we have wealth funds, we have sovereign wealth funds, we have insurance companies. And essentially, as more and more investors, particularly sophisticated investors, are looking at their options in this higher for longer world, they're thinking, you know, I need a premium yield because I can get 5% on treasuries right now, but I also want stability. And those are the things that are attracting now, even further down the food chain in terms of family offices and retail. And I think as the asset class grows, and we're calling it kind of the new paradigm, as investors look at the benefits that private credit is offering, and they're seeing some very sophisticated players in this market, they're saying, how can we participate in this asset class?
Do you see any red flags that are bubbling up in private credit? Any corners?
Yeah, well, the thing that is most, I think, concerning to anybody who has experience in the asset class is high interest rates. Because the thing that, when you look at your portfolio with rates now at 5.5% from a benchmark perspective versus zero a year and a half ago, the interest coverage is shrinking across portfolios. And so everyone looks at that as a risk, and it's a real risk. And so you have to build a portfolio that is ready to accept those higher rates. And the way we do it is we look at very defensive sectors that have high free cash flows, that are owned by private equity firms who can grow these businesses to keep pace not only with where GDP is, but also where some of the higher growth sectors in areas like healthcare and business services are going. So to give an example, the average growth in both revenues and EBITDA in our portfolio right now is about 12.5%. So when you look at the GDP, which is bouncing around 2, 3, 4%, something like that, you're looking at businesses that we think will grow through whatever cycle is coming. It looks like probably a soft or no landing is going to be expected. But our businesses are really faster growing than that. But they also tend to be businesses that are market leaders, that will be able to sustain any kind of downturn, even if we do have it.
What's the deal flow you're seeing from your private equity sponsors? What's it been like today in this higher interest rate environment?
We just got the October numbers. We are the most, as of the end of October, the most active direct lender in the market right now in the United States. The reason that that's happening is that our private equity sponsors continue to have dry powder that they are raising in their own funds. They wanted to put it to work. They've identified areas of interest, as I mentioned, in these defensive sectors that in this current economy are doing well. And they realize that next year is probably going to be a better year than people think, probably not going to have a recession. And so they're trying to vote with their feet, and they're looking for scaled players like Churchill that can write large checks where we have relationships. And I think I mentioned this last time, we're an investor in their funds, and so we're sort of first in line to be asked to join these deals. We still tend to be pretty picky. We probably do about 5% of the deals that come in the door. So we're looking for only the best of the best, knowing that we don't know what's coming next year. I mean, think about where we were 2 or 3 years ago with COVID and interest rates. And the good thing, and this goes back to this issue of a bubble, these middle market companies have been tested. They've been tested through low rates. They've been tested through high rates. They've been tested through low inflation. They've been tested through high inflation. And so I think the benefit that needs to be explained more, and this is part of this education, is why these companies actually do well, in some cases even better than some of the larger companies, because they tend to be in structures that are more conservative, and also with lending partners such as ourselves that are basically built for the long run. We're going to work through whatever problem these companies have to get to a final resolution that's a positive one.
Since your clients have money to use that's sitting on the sidelines, what do you think this tells us about the direction of the economy if they're willing to take more risk?
Yeah, well, I think that amazingly, it looks like the Fed has engineered some kind of soft landing. We'll see what happens. It feels like their language continues to be hawkish. They want to keep people on their toes. But if that's the case, and I do believe that it is, that next year will be a solid year, that could be a good thing. Now, in general, I do believe that inflation will be higher and rates will still be higher. But this is kind of the normal that we forgot about. That hasn't been with us for 15 years, right? We've had zero interest rates for a large part of that time. This zero gravity environment we got used to, all of a sudden, we're like the Apollo astronauts that they get, back, or anybody from in these long space missions, and they can't walk because they're not used to the weight of gravity. That's kind of how we're feeling right now. I think the world is not used to having a 5% Fed funds rate, but in fact, that's the average over the last 60 years. So I think we're returning to that, which is good, because when you have zero interest rates, it sort of inspires some problematic behavior. But I think this new normal is actually very positive for private credit and for investors in general.
Randy, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate you coming in the studio. Again, Randy Schwimmer, he's co-head of senior lending and is senior managing director at Churchill Asset Management, one of the leading private credit providers in the marketplace. And again, it's a business. I'm just looking at some Bloomberg reporting here. Private credit market has roughly tripled in size since 2015. We're going to have more on that coming up. This is Bloomberg. Let's get some company news right now with Lisa Mateo.
Thanks, Paul. Barclays may part ways with thousands of investment banking clients to boost profitability. The Financial Times, it says the lender is considering dropping more than 2,500 customers out of a total of over 10,000, which may cut risk-weighted assets by as much as $25 billion. Barclays right now down just a fraction. A setback for organizing efforts over at Tesla. We have more on that from Bloomberg's Gina Cervetti.
Tesla has fought off allegations it illegally terminated dozens of New York employees in response to a unionization campaign. A regional director for the U.S. National Labor Relations Board dismissed a case against Tesla filed by the Workers United Union. Workers United had said Tesla fired a group of employees in Buffalo after some workers announced a union campaign.
Shares of Tesla right now, they're up about 0.7%. Now, meanwhile, Tesla rival Rivian has made its R1T electric pickup available to lease in 14 U.S. states. Now, leasing is mostly available on higher-end models that can cost more than $90,000. Now, it also qualifies for that $7,500 federal tax credit. The news comes as Tesla gets ready to release its Cybertruck on Thursday. Right now, Rivian is down just a fraction. And General Motors plans to cut spending on its self-driving unit. The Financial Times says the carmaker will outline its plan tomorrow. Now, GM's quarterly investments into Cruise run about $700 million. Cruise suspended its self-driving operations in October after California regulators banned the vehicles from the state's roads following an accident involving a pedestrian. GM right now up about 0.5%. Those are the company stories we're following. I'm Lisa Mateo. This is Bloomberg.
Headlines and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. Suddenly, yields in focus again. That's giving a lift to stocks right now. The 2-year Treasury yield that has dipped below 4.8%. We're at 4.77 right now. That is a decline of 7 basis points. That's because, we'll credit Fed speak here. The Governor Christopher Waller saying the recent slowdown may indicate policies tight enough to contain inflation. Waller also noting he's confident the U.S. can pull off a soft landing. The S&P 500 pushing away from the session lows that we saw earlier. S&P 500 right now up 8 points. That's up 0.2%, adding to the 8% gain that we've seen in November. Right now the index 45.59. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, that is up 130 points. That's a rise of 0.4%. Dow being led higher by shares of Boeing after an analyst upgrade. Boeing shares right now, they are up about 2.3%. And the NASDAQ 100, 28 points higher. That's a rise of 0.2%. Apple, among the most actively traded shares, up 0.75%. We check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Jess and Paul.
Amazing job, as always.
As always. I mean, just
kills it.
It's like he's been doing it his whole career. You know, it's not
decades.
Only 30 plus whatever. How do you like the scarf? I was told I look like Paddington the bear. It's freezing in here.
It is great. 'Tis the season.
But you don't
for
get to
scarves.
do it up like the young guys, the hip guys, how they film. No,
Like that?
The hip guys? Oh, the
hip. What are you saying? I'm not.
I'll help you. I'll help
Jess
you.
will help you.
Commercial
Okay.
break.
You'll probably strangle me with it.
No.
All right, John Tucker, thank you very much. We appreciate it. Jess Met and Paul Sweeney, we're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio, streaming live on YouTube as well. 2023 was not a great year, kids, for the IPO market. It was just kind of muted at best here. I guess there's a little bit more hope for 2024. And we had some news today. Shine, the China-founded online fashion company that won over hundreds of millions of shoppers around the world, has confidentially, how confidentially can it be if it's filed to go public in the U.S. and what could be one of the biggest IPOs in years? Brianne Lynch joins us. She's head of market insight at Equity Zen. So, Brianne, just give us a little summation. How was 2023 in terms of IPO activity?
Thanks for having me. 2023 was certainly an extremely quiet year for IPOs. So far, we've seen about 23 billion in IPO proceeds, higher than last year, but drastically lower than the 300 billion we had seen up to this point in 2021. So it's been a quiet year, and the fall cohort of IPOs that we did see, so Klaviyo, Instacart, Arm, Birkenstock, really did not pave the way for others to follow. It looks like Birkenstock, as of today, is the only one trading above their open price. So it's been a tough year for IPOs, yet there is a lot of demand for IPOs, and there are thousands of unicorn companies sitting on the sidelines, figuring out their next move.
What does this mean for 2024 then?
Yeah, I do think we'll see the market pick up in 2024, both from a macro perspective. As you talked about a bit earlier, we're seeing better macro indicators. We have job growth. We have strong GDP. Inflation is cooling. There's an end in sight when it comes to rate hikes or, even rate cuts. So that puts us in a better position. And ultimately, a lot of these companies are feeling a lot of pressure from both early investors and shareholders to achieve liquidity. Look at Reddit, a company that was rumored today to be considering an IPO in 2024. This is a company that was founded in 2005. So they've been private for 18 years. There's a lot of pent-up demand for liquidity, and while platforms like EquityZen can enable some of that liquidity while they're private, it really takes a public market exit for vast number of investors to have access and, that wide-scale liquidity for early shareholders.
Is Kim Kardashian going to save the IPO market? I hear she's got a company called Skims, which I'm sure John Tucker is aware of, but...
Oh, he knows.
That's where I got this scarf.
Yeah. So talk to us about, I don't know, what do you know about Skims?
Sure. So Skims kind of bucks the trend of some of these other companies. They were just founded in 2019, so a relatively young company, valued at a $4 billion valuation over the summer, but they're rapidly growing. They obviously have a strong brand name. The connection with Kim Kardashian certainly helps. And, from what I've heard, they have a strong product as well. So if they did IPO next year, they would certainly be different than a lot of these 10, 15, almost 20-year-old companies that we expect to hit the markets.
What industry groups are doing better at going public at this point versus others that are struggling? Is it more company specific or is it more industry specific?
I think it is company specific to some extent. There are certain things that any company is going to need to exhibit to have a successful IPO. They need to be showing profitability, they need to be showing growth, and they need to have a strong brand that investors know and recognize. That being said, a lot of these companies this fall showed some of those elements and still weren't successful. The industries that we're seeing the most investor interest in the private markets are AI and machine learning, so not surprising, information technology, so pure tech companies, and fintech. So those are the areas we're seeing interest in the private markets. When you look at AI and machine learning, a lot of these companies are younger companies who are less likely to be close to an IPO. So I think some of these pure tech companies that have really attractive multiples could be the ones, that have a more successful debut.
Brianna, I wonder what are the bankers saying as to why they didn't get more done in 2023? Like back in my day, as long as this market wasn't crashing, I could push out a lot of stuff out the door, particularly if companies that are really looking for some liquidity. What are they saying here? What kind of market do they need? I mean, the S&P is up 16, 17, 18%. Even equal weighted, it's up 4 or 5%. So it's not like the market's down.
Yeah, I think you're right. The macro indicators show that we are in a pretty good place for companies to exit. I think that there's just a lot of trepidation in the market, given that we haven't seen a blockbuster IPO be successful, this year or last year, really. So I think it's more of investors are nervous. They're looking for someone to lead the pack and kind of tell everyone, okay, this is going to work out fine. And we have yet to really see that. I do think once we see one or two really successful IPOs, the doors will open more because, the macro factors are there, and it should be a decent market to exit. That being said, I think another factor that impacts a lot of these companies is that if they raise capital in 2021, it's very unlikely that that valuation is still where the market is unless they've grown into it. So they're just going to have to accept that they IPO at a lower valuation, if they're trying to exit.
Well, Shine could be maybe one of these companies because it's, I think, according to the Wall Street Journal reporting, Shine, it's a Chinese company, so that could be an issue for some people, but it's now based in Singapore, was valued at around $66 billion in a fundraising round in May, and is likely to aim for an even higher valuation in an initial public offering. So I guess, and it's got Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley. So, I mean, it seems like all the elements are there for Shine. Do we have any sense of timing, Shine? Would it be early 24, later 24?
Indications look like this would be an early 2024 IPO, but this is also a company that has had its valuation decrease. They raised capital in 2022 at a $100 billion valuation. Earlier this year, raised again at a $66 billion valuation. And as you said, looking at an $80 or $90 billion valuation. So they haven't bucked that trend of companies that have had to, accept that their 2021, 2022 valuation may not be where the market is anymore. But to your point, it's a company that has achieved $23 billion in revenue, had its most profitable half in the first half of this year. It was growing rapidly with new distribution centers in the US, Canada, and Europe. They're opening new manufacturing centers in Brazil and India. So a lot of growth going on there, but also some concerns about their relationship with China, IP infringement, labor practices, and some other things. So certainly not a straightforward story on this one.
We only have about a minute left, but what other companies should we keep on our radar that could potentially go public next year?
Yeah, Reddit's one that we mentioned. They are in conversations to potentially file next year. They're private for a very long time and really have solidified themselves as one of the leading social media platforms in the U.S. They made, a lot of splashy news in the era of the meme stocks. Their subreddits, Wall Street Bets, was really, the catalyst for a lot of the retail momentum in the stock market. So I think they are an important one to watch. And SeatGeek is another one that has not confidentially, had filed to go public, hasn't yet, but has grown significantly. And we know they're considering an IPO. So we have eyes on that one as well.
All right. Well, hopefully 24 will be a better IPO market. Then we have more opportunities to talk to Brianne. Brianne Lynch is head of market insight at EquityZen. And I guess the article out on the Bloomberg Terminal today, Reddit leads class of 2024 IPO candidates testing the water. So we'll be on the lookout for Reddit, maybe this China-founded online fashion research company Shine, and maybe some others as well. Looking at the markets here, we have the S&P up 1/3 of 1%, so we're kind of gaining a little bit of momentum here as we get into the meat of the day of trading. NASDAQ up about 0.3 of 1% as well. Yields coming in ever so slightly. The 10-year Treasury off 4 basis points, 4.34%. Boy, the days of 5%, that wasn't that long ago, but boy. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. We'll get world and national news with Immerse.
All right, thank you, Paul. CIA Director William Burns is in Qatar for talks with Israeli and Qatari officials on the continued release of hostages held by Hamas and other aspects of the Gaza conflict. Burns' arrival comes as Egyptian and Qatari officials said Israel and Hamas agreed to extend the 4-day truce by 2 more days. At least 69 hostages have been freed by Hamas since the ceasefire began. In exchange, Israel has released 150 Palestinian prisoners. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Antony Blinken will visit Israel for the 3rd time since Hamas attacked on October 7th. We get the latest on that from Bloomberg's Galit Altstein in Tel Aviv.
The statement that we're talking about from the State Department said that Blinken will also stress the need to sustain the increased flow of humanitarian assistance to Gaza, to secure the release of all hostages, Israeli hostages, and to improve protections for the civilians in Gaza.
Bloomberg's Galit Altstein in Tel Aviv there. The Koch network is endorsing former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley for president. A political network, Americans for Prosperity Action, founded by the Koch brothers, will provide more organizational muscle and financial backing as Haley goes up against Florida Governor Ron DeSantis for the number 2 spot in the GOP presidential race. Cyber Monday was the biggest shopping day ever, With U.S. consumers spending $12.4 billion, that's up 9.6% from just a year ago, according to Adobe, which collects the data. We get more with Bloomberg's Simone Foxman.
That's even higher than the growth that we saw on Black Friday, 7.5% higher. This overall equates to $38 billion spent through Cyber Week, which started with Black Friday and ended on Cyber Monday.
Bloomberg Simone Foxman there. The report from Adobe came on the same day Amazon said its extended Black Friday and Cyber Monday holiday shopping event was its biggest ever. Customers around the world buying more than 1 billion items. This is Bloomberg.
Updates, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker, the Bloomberg Newsroom, with this Bloomberg Business Flash. Let's start with Treasuries extending their November rally. Traders wading through remarks from a slew of Fed speakers. That is pushing yields lower. Lower yields, pushing stocks higher. The 2-year, which is more policy reactive, that's 7 basis points lower right now. The yield 4.77. S&P 500 adding to the 8% November rally. You had 9 of the 11 major industry groups higher right now. Over at State Street Global, Hannah Smith can picture more stock gains ahead.
And so if you go and purchase some of the items, the money comes straight to our organization, and we spend it on those very items. It was very successful for us. We were able to get a lot of work done in Ukraine and Jordan specifically this past year.
Well, that's not Hannah Smith, but whatever. S&P 500, 16 points higher. That is up 0.4%. We're at 45.67. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up 178 points. That's 0.5% higher. Right now, 35,511. The NASDAQ 100 is 68 points higher. That's up 0.4% right now. And the VIX, haven't done Wall Street's fear gauge in a while. That is hovering right around 12. And Reddit, again, holding talks with potential investors for an IPO. Boeing higher as it enjoys an upgrade by RBC, and that's one of the reasons we have the Dow higher. Crocs, remember them? They're higher. Raymond James calling it a strong buy. And we check the markets for you all day long, right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Jess and Paul.
I think Boeing counts their backlog now in like decades. It's unbelievable what's happening. They can't build them fast enough.
I can't keep track. It was Chicago... Seattle, Chicago.
Now the D.C. So they lost. My call is they lost their engineering chops when they left Seattle. That's just my personal call. Then they went to,
Interesting.
Anyway, good for them. John Tucker, thank you so much. Jess Met and Paul Sweeney live here on our Bloomberg Interactive Broker. This is a treat, folks. Neil Hennessy joins us, Chief Market Strategist, the Hennessy Advisors. He started this back in 1989. I'm not going to call him old. I'm going to say he's a seasoned investor.
Seasoned.
But we share something. We both started our careers at Payne Weber, which is a great brokerage firm, investment bank, great retail presence. Back in the day, it was acquired by, I don't know where it is now. But now it's basically the guts of UBS here in the U.S., but the House of Payne. Neil, thanks so much for joining us here. You see a market like this, SPX up 17, 18%. But you take out the Magnificent Seven, and what do we got here? So how do you look at markets like this? It doesn't feel like a healthy market.
Well, the market really hasn't gone anyplace. I mean, as of yesterday, you look at the NASDAQ was up 37%, but you take out those 8 stocks.
Yep.
We'll get to the Magnificent Seven here in a second. But essentially, you take those out, the market's up 7%. So it's really gone no place. The Dow's up 2.5% or 3%. So those 8 companies have controlled the market. But interesting enough, then you get to 3 weeks ago, I guess we came up with the new slogan, Magnificent Seven, Netflix went out. But that made me think to go back to 1960 when the movie was made, The Magnificent Seven. So I'll give you something to think about here is in that movie, the ending, they hired 7 gunslingers to help protect the town, and there are only 3 left. So you tell me which 3 of the 7 are going to be left.
So what do you do with a market that has that lack of breadth? I know you guys at Hennessy are value investors. So how do you approach this market? How has it changed maybe over the last several years?
Value is a place that you want to be if you want to play again.
Okay.
So look at the S&P 500. You're talking about Apple is over 7% of that. 13% of the NASDAQ. And if you think logically, would you put 13% of your money in one stock? Probably not.
Right.
Okay. So, but that's what people have been doing. At some point in time, just like the late 90s when all the value managers were getting fired because if you weren't 23 years old and you didn't have a .com on your forehead, you were fired.
Yep.
But essentially, I love the mid-cap arena, like the Hennessy Mid-Cap 30. And the reason I like that is mid-cap stocks have really outperformed everything over time. and they're large enough to withstand an economic tsunami. They're big enough to make an acquisition that would be accretive to them, but from a smaller company, but they're also big enough to be acquired by a larger company and be accretive there. And so you see a lot of value in that mid-cap arena right now.
What stocks or industries in mid caps do you like?
Well, energy's there, but I mean, if you look at names that people don't associate too much when you get the radio, TV, or something like that, is Comfort Systems, big deal. But most likely they did part of this building because they're industrial and building and putting in the ventilation, heating, air, things of that sort. They earn $8 a share and pay $1 dividend. So logic would tell you there's plenty of room to raise the dividend.
Stock's up 70% year to date. So we're calling for a $7 billion market cap company. FIX is a ticker.
Yeah, and then you can look at Sprouts Farmers Market.
Wait. This is a public company. Hold on. I'm going to go ahead. I'm just going.
Sprouts
popping up on the terminal.
Okay. It's farmers market, and truly, when you walk into the store, you feel like you're in a farmers market. There's produce all over, and if you think about inflation, food prices that have gone up, and you go, well, geez, do I really want to get into a specialty market like that or Whole Foods? Well, there's a big difference between Sprouts and say Whole Foods, and that's simple that. You look at the produce and you look at the vegetables and stuff, and you just add a little bit of pasta, and you can make a very cheap meal for a family. And that's their niche. They have about 300 stores, mainly on the West Coast. But, here's this company that makes $3 a share and doesn't pay a dividend.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's so much value out there. You just keep looking for it and then buy and hold it.
SFM is the ticker there.
Yes.
Up, it's got about a 4.3 billion market cap, up 30% year to date. How do you guys at Hennessy define value? I mean, is there a PE threshold? How do you define Sprouts Farmers Markets? I know an analyst didn't come to you and say, hey, I just went into this great farmers market. I think we should buy it. So I'm guessing you guys screen here.
Well, you're right. Everybody has, every money manager has a formula.
Yep.
Okay. And we have a formula, and what we do is once a year we rework the formula. So essentially, it's looking for companies between $1 and $10 billion in market cap. We're looking for increase in earnings. The main point being a price to sales ratio of 1.5 or less. So we're not going to pay more than $1.50 for $1 in sales. And that's where the value is. Because earnings, just like anybody, you can manipulate earnings by taking a write-off or adding this or taking a gain. And earnings don't pay your bills. Cash flow pays your bills. And so when you start to look at a truer number, unless you're going to do an Enron, it's sales, right? And so we won't, like I say, pay it more than $1.50 for $1 in sales. Now you take those magnificent, easy for me to say, the 7 or 8 stocks, and you're looking at a price of sales of somewhere in the 9 to 10. So, they're buying. They're 8 times what our threshold is, at least.
What are you selling?
Well, we're not selling anything because when we do this formula, at the end of the formula, we buy the 30 companies, that hit the list and essentially buy them in equal dollar amounts, hold them for 1 year, and then readjust the portfolio to then the 30 stocks that hit our list and buy them in equal dollar amounts. But the last stage of that is we're looking for companies that have, or stocks that have price appreciation over a 3 to 6 month period. And then we buy the top 30 that have the best price appreciation after 1 year. And you sort of ask, why would you do price appreciation? Aren't you just chasing the market? The reality is really smart managers, more than me, they've been buying these companies for a while. They've just been holding their hand little by little by little by little. So over a 3, 6, 12-month period, it goes up. So we're not catching it in the first inning.
Right.
We're catching the stocks in the 3rd inning, 4th inning, which is where you want to be.
Okay. Sounds reasonable to me. It's a plan. You've been doing it a long time. It must be working. Neil Hennessy, Chief Market Strategist, Hennessy Advisors, based out there. What's the name of that town again?
Novato, Marin County.
Novato, Marin County, which is really a beautiful place to be. And I don't know why, everybody doesn't set up shop in Marin County. We're going to have more coming up. This is Bloomberg. Let's get some company news right now with Lisa Mateo.
You got it, Paul. Another social media site could be coming to Wall Street. Reddit is weighing an IPO as soon as the first part of next year. Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow says a few things have to be considered.
Reddit rose to prominence because of the 2021 meme stock frenzy, and yet nothing's happened since 2022, January 2022 at least. 2022 went on to be the worst year for US IPOs in about a decade, and based on the volumes and IPO performance of 2023, we're only just going to surpass that 2022 mire that we had.
Now, also taking the IPO leap in 2024, you have Rubrik. That's a Microsoft-backed cloud and data security startup. Kim Kardashian's shapewear company Skims, and fast fashion retailer Shein. My daughter loves that one. Speaking of kids, if you or your kids missed out on Taylor Swift's Eras Tour movie, don't worry. You'll soon be able to watch it at home. Are you ready for it? Yes, are you ready for it? The pop star announced the movie is going to be released for streaming on December 13th, which is also her 31st birthday. Now, it's going to be available on streaming services, including Apple TV, YouTube, Amazon's Prime Video, and includes 3 songs that have not been seen in theaters. We have Apple right now up about 0.5%, Alphabet up a fraction, Amazon down just a fraction as well. And you might want to check that old Gmail account. If you haven't used your Google account in at least 2 years and you want to keep it, you'll have to sign in by the end of the week. The company will be phasing out those inactive accounts on Google Drive, Docs, and Gmail on Friday, and that's due to security issues. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Lisa Mateo, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, we've got some green on the screen out there for sure. S&P 500 up 1/3%. Same for the NASDAQ. Dow up about 0.5%. So a little bit of movement there. We'll take that. The VIX, as we've been calling out for Tom Keene, is below 13. How about that? Yields come in also. 10-year Treasury down about 4 basis points, 4.34% on your 10-year Treasury. WTI crude oil, it's up 2.5% today, trying to retrace some of the pullback we've seen over the last several weeks. It's $76.74 per barrel there. Bitcoin up 2.3%, pushing up against 38,000 on Bitcoin. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. Amy Marsh has got world and national news for us.
All right, thank you, Paul. The truce appears to remain intact, but the Israeli military says 3 separate explosions targeting troops from northern Gaza and subsequent shootings have violated a truce agreement with Hamas. We get more with Bloomberg's Kaylee Lines in Washington.
Now, it's not clear at this time what that means for the overall state of the truce. There has been no indication of further fighting or escalation at this point. Overall, broadly, it does still seem that is intact, but that is going to be something we're very carefully watching.
Bloomberg's Kaylee Lines in Washington, D.C. Former President Trump threatened to reopen contentious fights over the Affordable Care Act after he failed to repeal it while he was in the White House. He says he's seriously looking at alternatives to Obamacare if he wins a second term. Wendy Schiller is director of the Alfred Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy at Brown University and says history shows this could prove very difficult for Trump.
People get used to the idea of a program with benefits that are available to them. And once it's entrenched, that is very difficult to shake once people get used to it. And that's about a 6 to 10 year window, which we've now passed when it comes to Obamacare.
Wendy Schiller at Brown University. Hunter Biden has agreed to testify before the House Oversight Committee in a public hearing. This move is a response to a subpoena from Republicans investigating nearly every aspect of his business dealings as they pursue an impeachment inquiry into his father, President Biden. And all 41 construction workers trapped in a collapsed mountain tunnel in northern India for more than 2 weeks were pulled out today. A crowd of local residents gathered around the tunnel. They erupted in joy, and they set off firecrackers in celebration. Officials presented the first rescued workers with garlands made of flowers, hanging them around their necks as the crowd cheered. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg. Paul and Jess.
All right, Amy Morris, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Boy, there's some weird stories out there, Jess, and this is one of them, thanks to the Wall Street Journal. So far this year, Michael Hogan has spent more than $5,000 on metal bar stools, a curved sofa, and other modern decor to furnish a newly built home he'll never live in. That is because the dwelling is so small, it is better suited for a resident the size of a mouse. Hogan is among a new cohort of dollhouse devotees who are shaking up how grown-ups indulge in the classic children's hobby. Mark that up as a thing I never thought was a thing.
Especially the headline. She spends $100,000 a month.
$1,000 a month.
$1,000 decorating homes. No one will ever go inside.
Yeah, so I guess this is a thing for many recent entrants got into itty-bitty decor, which is what it's called, while homebound. Oh, I get they got into it while homebound during the pandemic, reeled in by social media and reality shows as Best in Miniature, which made its debut on CBS last year.
Dollhouse enthusiasts today are also younger than the much grayer crowd Anderson, who lives in Ontario, Canada, used to see at dollhouse conventions. I don't know about you. I've never been to a dollhouse convention, Paul.
No, but I'm going to stay away from that, I think. For Hogan, whose real domicile was a late 1970s colonial in Columbus, Ohio, the pastime he took up a few years ago has become a practical way for him to live out his penchant, is that how you pronounce it? For decorating at 1/12 scale.
So part of the hobby's appeal is that it serves as a relaxing, creative outlet, according to anecdotal sources that they quoted in here.
All right, I don't know about this. All right, I'll go with it. It's harmless and have fun with that. But that's a lot more money than I would have thought.
So you're gonna pass on?
Yeah, I'm gonna.
Sweetie's
not a
fan.
No, we'll see. S&P 500 up 1/3%. Same for the NASDAQ. So a little bit of a lift there. And we're going to break it down with Abigail Doolittle in the next hour because she is our markets guru. And looking at WTI crude oil, it's higher again today, $76.77. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller.
Why were the economists so wrong? What are the economists getting wrong?
Isn't this a slam dunk time to buy U.S. Treasuries?
Soft landing, hard landing, no landing. I don't know.
True. What the heck does that mean?
I don't know.
Breaking market news and insight from Bloomberg experts.
We're going to be in an environment with higher rates for longer.
The 5-day in-office work week is effectively dead.
It's definitely a good sign that we're not ready to land this economy just yet.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, coming up in this hour, we're going to break down the markets with Abigail Doolittle. She covers all the markets for Bloomberg, so she's going to join us here in studio. Jen Flitton, head of U.S. Government Affairs at Invesco. She's going to join us to discuss all things D.C. policy, Israel, foreign aid, all that type of stuff from the perspective of a big investment manager at Invesco. And then Ronald Lagnano, Universal Research Director, offers his outlook for the markets. That's all coming up in this hour. But first, let's go to Mr. Charlie Pella for Bloomberg Business.
Thank you very much, Paul Sweeney. After yesterday's decline, the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, they're all pushing higher right now. We are looking at a 15-point gain on the S&P 500 index to 45.65, up now by just about 0.3%. Dow Jones Industrial Average up 172, higher by 0.5%, while the NASDAQ Composite Index up now by 48 points for NASDAQ. That is a gain right now of about 0.3%. Stocks and bonds extending their November gains after the latest Fed speak bolstered speculation that the central bank will have room to cut interest rates in 2024. 10-year at 4.33%, with a 2-year that's yielding 4.75%. Gold up $26 the ounce, now at $2,040 on the precious metal, up by 1.3%. West Texas Intermediate crude rallying 2.7%, 76.85 a barrel. Oil higher as OPEC Plus talks remain difficult, with no signs yet of a solution to a dispute over production levels for some nations. Fernando Valle is a senior analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence, and he was a guest this morning right here on Bloomberg Markets.
The issue is that because oil prices are lower, their cuts aren't having the effect they expected. Those oil countries don't have the balance sheets that Saudi does to shoulder that burden. So they aren't cutting as much. They need the revenue still. And Saudi is also getting strained, and they want to put some of that strain to the other members.
And you can hear more of the conversation with Fernando Valle on the Tape podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Stocks higher, and so are oil shares. They're advancing right now. Case in point, ExxonMobil up by about 0.8%. Among the other majors, we got BP up 0.8%. Chevron up now by 1.3%. Recapping, S&P up 15, a gain there of 0.3%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pella, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Jess Met and Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. We're also streaming live on that YouTube thing. I think that's the internet, youtube.com. Search Bloomberg Global Radio, and that's where you'll find us there. The market's up, as Charlie was just mentioning here. I want to bring in Abigail Doolittle. She follows the markets for us at Bloomberg. Abigail, we were talking earlier on the show to Neil Hennessy. He is the founder of the Hennessy Advisors, chief strategist there. And he's out there looking for mid-cap value. That's his strategy. And he screens off of revenue growth and revenue valuation, not earnings multiples.
Fundamentals, you mean?
Yeah,
wow,
exactly.
That's pretty unique
Bottoms
in this day and age.
Fundamentals.
Oh my gosh, I want to meet this Neil Hennessy.
and he's got some good performance. So it's interesting out there. It's not just following the macro trends. There are a lot of people out there that are actually doing the fundamental research work, aren't they, and trying to find some winners.
I think that is the case, and from a correlation standpoint and a dispersion standpoint, so right now correlation is rising. I'd have to put in a broader framework to see dispersion is down. That is a way of saying, with dispersion being down, that there are stock pickers out there at work because there's not so much macro fear. When you have dispersion and correlations go higher, it tells you that pretty much everybody is seeing things the same way and they either want out or want in. What stands out to me the most today, and that actually reminds me also of a favorite phrase back in the day, GARP, growth at a reasonable value. I'm sure that will be coming back. But is this move in yields? I mean, it's really ridiculous, for a lack of a better way to put it. We have the 2-year yield down 13 basis points, the 5-year yield down 11 basis points. And while this move isn't so big, it's actually just the biggest drop since that CPI, slightly cooler CPI print a few weeks ago that really stirred the markets to the upside, these animal spirits. What stands out to me about it, it seems to be around Fed talk. We had one Fed governor who basically said he's impressed. It was Christopher Waller saying that he's impressed with the economic activity and what's going on from the economy, and it seems as though we can probably hold rates steady. On the other hand, we have Governor Michelle Bowman indicating that she thinks that rates have to be hiked. Well, the markets are going with the interpretation they want, and on that we have yields tumbling. Now, from a technical standpoint, when we tie in the Bloomberg Dollar Index, which is now down 0.5%, down for a 4th day in a row, the longest losing streak since October 11th, it seems as though we're going to see some kind of almost capitulation type bounce in the dollar. That could be wrong. Yes, it's oversold. I know you love that RSI. It's oversold. If you take a look at the chart, it's a pretty consistent pattern when it gets oversold, and then it's really falling out of a specific technical pattern where the sellers just get exhausted and the buyers finally step up. If that happens, we could have a reversal of this, but the bigger question, you're not supposed to do this as a chartist, but since I'm really not, I will give myself the latitude, is we have PCE on Thursday, we have Fed Chair Jay Powell on Friday, who will be speaking at Spelman College. I don't know how it works for the scripts of his speeches, but what I do believe over the last decade or so of really, following Fed speak is that they float these messages, they see what the market does, the market, quote unquote, does their work, but does the Fed like the work that's been done? He may have the freedom to be able to talk the market in a different direction. Who knows? Maybe PCE does that. Maybe it comes in as expected or a little bit higher. But right now, there's a strong risk on mood, at least from stocks, because we have to remember, bonds are actually rallying in a big way.
Speaking of RSI, when you look at that for the S&P 500, up close to 71 there, so obviously above that 70 sort of lined in the sand there when people are talking about overbought. But what do you think the technicals are telling us, just given that in the last month, the S&P 500 has gained close to about 11% after trading around 4,100. Now it's trading around 45.62.
So great questions, Jess, for sure. And it's funny, Steve Sosnick sent me an email a little while ago over Interactive Brokers, basically saying, just 2 or 3 weeks ago, everybody was saying the sky is falling. Now everybody's saying, the sky is here. It reminds me actually a little bit of 2008, when overall it was a downtrend, but there were these violent moves down, and then these violent, I guess you would call it a bear market in retrospect, rally higher, and the sentiment would shift with it. It almost reminds me of that. The degree of the shift and the parabolic uptrends tells me that investors, there's not a lot of certainty. Neil Hennessy may be looking at mid-cap value. There might be other investors looking at small-cap value, but overall, there isn't a consensus in terms of that certainty that you just have a nice, steady uptrend. Instead, we have this sideways stuff. Relative to the S&P 500 technicals, I'm pulling that up right now. And something that I should note, and this is true for both, so this is interesting. This supports the dollar chart because you have that oversold RSI, or excuse me, overbought RSI that you were just talking about. An overbought or an oversold RSI isn't necessarily bearish or bullish. You want to see the direction. So you could have an RSI, and I've seen it on Tesla, and Bitcoin go all the way to 90. So long as it keeps going higher, it's actually strong momentum. What you're looking for is a move lower. So it's small, but we actually have that RSI above 70 is starting to curve down just a little bit. I would suggest that supports the uncertainty thesis.
Interesting. A lot of moving pieces out there on these markets. And again, we'll have some economic data this week. We'll have some Fed speak this week, so more for the market to digest. Abigail Doolittle, thank you so much for joining us. Abigail Doolittle covers all the markets for Bloomberg across all of our media. Right now, let's get to Washington, D.C., because there's a lot going on in Washington, D.C. that will impact markets, impact individual companies. So we'd like to get a sense of kind of what are the investors, the professional investors, how are they kind of discounting what's happening in Washington, D.C. and some of the policy and regulatory risks? So we always appreciate checking in with Jen Flitton. She is head of U.S. government affairs at Invesco, a huge money management firm. Jen, I'm sure there's a whole bunch of issues that you guys are following down there in D.C. I'd like to start with my government. Is it going to shut down anytime soon? Do I need to be worried about that?
Well, not until January,
Okay.
At least for certain appropriations bills. So a couple weeks ago, they were able to pass a continuing resolution. That's that stopgap funding for the government into January. So we're not going to have a holiday shutdown threat. We'll have two basic tiers. It'll be January 19, which you'll have the agriculture bill, the energy bill, the MilCon and VA bill. Those will be dealt with by January 19, theoretically. And then you'll have a February 2nd where you get the really hard appropriations bills done, right? So that's defense, labor, HHS, homeland, think immigration, interior, think environment. And so they'll have to come together over the holidays and then going into next year on these bills, the House and Senate.
So how likely are we going to see another 11th hour type of situation leading up to these deadlines?
It's pretty likely, I'm afraid. I mean, look, you have the Senate that is marking to FY23 numbers, and you have the House that's marking to FY22 numbers. That's a big difference in money, right? So they're going to have to find some
Why are they
way.
doing it differently?
Yeah, so the agreement on the debt ceiling negotiations over June was to mark to FY23, which is what the Senate's doing. But conservatives in the House were very unhappy with that budget ceiling negotiation. So they got appropriations to agree to mark to FY22.
Interesting. All right, so they can't even agree on that. All right, so a lot is going to fall to this new House Speaker, Mike Johnson, Republican from Louisiana. Is there any reason to believe that he's going to be more successful integrating his far-right part of his party so they can actually get something done in the House?
That's an excellent question. And we're going to know a little bit about that over the next 48 hours as he meets with the conference and tries to get an agreement to move the NDAA, which is the National Defense Authorization Act, which must be done by the end of the year. They never let that lapse. It's been like 60 years since that's lapsed. So that has to get done before they break for the holidays. And then there's got to be some agreement around the supplemental bill, the $106 billion supplemental bill for Ukraine and Israel, Indo-Pacific, the border, and he is sort of juxtaposing the negotiations in the Senate and has to figure out what his own conference can swallow. And those meetings are happening this week.
So if I'm an investor and I'm thinking about Washington, D.C. and thinking about policy, am I beholden to literally a handful of representatives for just movement of my government?
Well, quite frankly, it is a very tight margin, not just in the House. You have about a 4-vote margin, and in the Senate, 1-vote margin. So yes, there has to be compromise. There has to be negotiated agreement. And that means making a lot of people unhappy in order to move these bills, these must-pass bills. And that, quite frankly, is the same situation that McCarthy was in that now Speaker Johnson is in. But the same is true for Majority Leader Schumer, the Democrat, and McConnell, who are trying to walk this tight line on NDAA and on the supplemental funding and on appropriations. So they're all still in the same seats. It's just, one different player here.
So as far as looking at how some of these deadlines kind of overlap with the next Federal Reserve, well, not the next Federal Reserve meeting, that decision's on December 13th, but the first meeting at the beginning of next year, it's actually January 30th and 31st. So you have some of these shutdown deadlines coming up close to that. How do you think this could potentially impact anything coming up when it comes to some of that policy decision when you have issues going on the other side with the government?
Yeah, I mean, quite frankly, Congress doesn't look much to the monetary policy issues of the Fed. And it's questionable, I think, how much the Fed considers the, annual budget appropriation process, the fiscal issues as it makes its monetary decisions. And so while it is a congruence of issues that are all going to arise at the same time, and I expect that will make the markets a little, volatile around these important deadlines. I do think that as we enter into 2024 with this election year, you're going to see after these appropriations bills are settled, the shift is going to be a hard shift into election year politics. And that really is going to be the driver going into 2024.
So is that kind of the message? Like if I'm a, Invesco portfolio manager, equity portfolio manager, or fixed income, and I call you up and I say, hey, what's the biggest, risk for me and my portfolio coming out of Washington, D.C.? Do you say it's just, I guess, the upcoming election? What are some of what's the big issue for you?
Yeah, so the next, 6, 8, 9 weeks are really going to be the vast majority of legislation that's going to get done. That's going to be, as I said, the NDAA, the approbes, but also some tax extenders, which are possible by the end of the year. And then it's going to be a lot of messaging bills. You're going to see in the House, they're going to try to do a lot of messaging. If they can't get something done on immigration within the context of this supplemental bill, they're going to continue to push on that border issue. It's going to be a major message for House Republicans. And then you're going to see a lot of executive action. You're going to see the agencies taking it upon themselves within their own discretion, or discretion as they define it, to move the agenda of the administration, things that they weren't able to get done over the last 3 years, or that they've been working to resolve and finalize over the past 3 years. And so that's really what I'm telling folks to look at right now, is watch those executive actions.
So what are the most immediate things that you're watching in the next few weeks as far as what people need to be focused on in Washington?
Well, first, we've got to watch these negotiations on appropriations, and we will be behind the scenes watching that very closely. But over the next 36, 48 hours, it'll be really interesting to see how these members sort of resolve on the NDAA, that Defense Authorization Act, which is very important. Conference technically meets on Thursday, but they could have a decision by Friday because they've been negotiating this behind the scenes. And there's some amendments that could be added to that we'll be looking for, some related to AI, some related to crypto, money laundering issues, some relating to outbound investment in China. So we're looking for whether those will be included in the final NDAA. But then it will be a race to the appropriations deadlines and making sure that they fund the government. That is important to the rating, right, of the U.S., but also sort of the faith in this Congress's ability to get things done.
Well, a lot of work to do. We'll certainly follow up with you, Jen, on that. Jen Flitton, she's the head of U.S. Government Affairs for Invesco, trying to keep track of all the legislation, all the policy work that's being done in Washington, D.C., and how it impacts Invesco portfolio managers and their investment holdings. The analogous person for Bloomberg Intelligence that does that work is Nathan Dean for Bloomberg Intelligence. It's so important for investors to have a good feel for what's going on down in Washington, D.C., and how it will impact markets. We're going to have more coming up. This is Bloomberg. Let's get some company news right now with Lisa Mateo.
You got it, Paul. U.S. consumers, they were out in full force over the big shopping holidays. According to Adobe, they spent a record $12.4 billion on Cyber Monday alone. That's an increase of 9.6% from a year ago. And Amazon said its extended Black Friday and Cyber Monday Holly shopping event was its biggest ever. Customers worldwide purchased more than 1 billion items on Amazon. Shares right now, they're down just a fraction. Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle, she has the retail roundup starting with Shopify.
They are saying that their overall period, they saw sales up 24% for a total of $9.3 billion. Really significant dollars. We have Amazon higher, Walmart, Best Buy, Gap, American Eagle, lots of retailers higher. As for the laggards, anything financially related, payment related, that's not called Affirm, into today had been down just a little bit.
Now, Abby had mentioned Affirm, and it looks like credit is helping retailers fuel spending. Bloomberg's Gina Cervetti has that story.
Buy now, pay later options are helping holiday shoppers extend their budgets so far this year and providing a boost to holiday spending. Adobe estimated that consumers used such flexible spending promotions to spend $7.3 billion from November 1st to November 26th.
Now that's up 14% from a year ago. Adobe says buy now, pay later usage. It hit a record high on Cyber Monday, contributing $940 million in online spending. Now that's up 42.5% over the previous year. Right now we have shares of Affirm. They're up about 7.5%. PayPal is up about 3%. Now if you take a look on the flip side, you have MasterCard up a fraction, Visa down a fraction. I'm Lisa Mateo.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We've got most stocks pushing higher. The Russell 2000 index, though, of small cap shares is lower right now, down by 0.1%. But to put that in context, the S&P 500 index up 0.2%. NASDAQ now advancing 0.3%. And the Dow Jones Industrial Average higher by 0.4%, up now by 132 points. Stocks and bonds are extending their November gains. The dollar fell with the latest Fed speak, bolstering speculation that policymakers will have more room to cut rates next year. The 10-year now yielding 4.34%, with a 2-year at 4.76%. Gold rallying $28 the ounce, now at $2,042, up 1.4%. West Texas Intermediate crude is up 2.7%, $76.90 for a barrel of WTI. Bitcoin surging 3.1%, now with a 38,000 handle. Bitcoin, 38,191 on Bitcoin. Micron Technology, the largest American maker of computer memory semiconductors, is lower after earnings, despite raising its revenue guidance for the quarter and beating estimates. Shares today of Micron Technology, they are down 2.7%. Among other chip makers, Intel up 0.3%, Advanced Micro Devices down 0.4%, and NVIDIA down 0.4%. That stock, by the way, up this year by 228%. Recapping, stocks higher, S&P up 10, a gain there of 0.2%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Jess Menton, Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, streaming live as well on YouTube, so you can find us there. Jess, I think you and I are going to have to be on top of our games for this next segment here. Our next guest got his undergraduate degree in chemical engineering from the University of Illinois. They have serious engineering there. Then, if that's not enough, he goes and gets a PhD in chemical engineering from Caltech, another pretty good engineering school, so I'm told. So what do you do with that? You go into financial services, of course. Ronald Lagnano joins us here. He's a research director for Immerse. Ronald, despite your career path, I got to ask you, just explain to me what you guys do at Immerse, because this is not a typical long or long-short equity fund, is it?
Right. Well, first, let me thank you for having me on the show. So Universa specializes in risk mitigation, specifically equity risk mitigation. Was founded by Mark Spitznagel, our CIO, about 15 years ago. And prior to that, he worked with Nassim Taleb, the author of The Black Swan, in another fund, which was also dedicated to, what we would call equity tail risk hedging. So what we provide to our investors is a highly convex risk mitigation strategy with the intent of raising not just the risk-adjusted returns, but the actual geometric average or compounded return of the investor's portfolio by specifically targeting and protecting against deep drawdowns, like we saw in the global financial crisis, also during the COVID pandemic in 2020.
So how are you viewing the market, and where do you think investors should put their money, and where do you think investors should potentially sell?
Well, so we don't try to forecast, market returns, particularly equities. But what we do look at is that what historically has been the cost effectiveness of different types of risk mitigation. So, our investors and most investors, as we know, for the longest time, stocks have been the dominant driver of return and volatility. That's likely to continue. But over the past 50 years, the equity risk premium has been substantial. So the S&P returned about 11.5% annually over the past 50 years, compared with 5.5% for bonds, specifically the Bloomberg U.S. Treasury Index. But investors, despite their need for equities to provide long-term capital growth, have an aversion to these severe drawdowns for a variety of reasons. Not the least of which is that when historically over the past century, when the S&P has fallen more than 30% in a drawdown, it's taken on average about 3 years for it to recover. So where investors have turned to historically has been sort of following the prescriptions of modern portfolio theory and basically using diversification, primarily with bonds, to protect against equity risk. And the traditional approach here, of course, is the basic paradigm is a 60-40 stock bond portfolio. Now, a lot of retail investors are sort of steered into this approach by advisors. But, one might argue, what about big, large institutional investors like the U.S. public pension funds? Well, surely, they do all kinds of things. They invest in private equity and alternatives, hedge funds. But it's been shown that in effect, pension funds are essentially large, diversified stock bond portfolios. So some research recently by Richard Ennis, who was a pioneer in institutional investor consulting, did an analysis of a composite of U.S. pensions, by doing a style analysis and regressing on a simple public asset portfolio of stocks and bonds. He found that effectively U.S. pensions are somewhere on a spectrum between a 60-40 and an 80-20 allocation in terms of their exposure to the risk factors. So this has sort of been what's relied on. But, what do we know about the 60-40? Well, we all know that it's misfired badly in 2022 as stocks and bonds melted down together. So now we see a lot of articles debating whether or not 60-40 is dead or alive as a strategy going forward. But our contention has always been that it's not really been a particularly effective, cost-effective, or reliable strategy to protect against equity drawdown. So what we advise our investors is to try and reduce that exposure to bonds. With current yields, they're not likely to provide the sort of protection we saw in the past, and turn to other alternatives like convex tail risk hedging.
So, Ronald, what percentage? I don't know if you know this or not. What percentage of pension funds are properly hedged, do you think?
Well, so I worked at a very large public pension for a while in asset allocation, actually the largest in the U.S. And I made some progress while I was there to get them to think a little differently about how they approach diversification, risk mitigation. The first is a recognition that bonds, while they do offer some protection in equity drawdown, you need a large allocation to make a difference. Furthermore, what bonds are doing for you when equities sell off, 2022 notwithstanding, is that you're basically hedged because you're simply not in equities. So what happens when the market recovers, invariably you have this performance drag that reduces your return over time. And it's been significant, particularly since the global financial crisis. I think it's part of the reason why pension funds have not really been able to recover in terms of their funded ratio over this period where we actually had the longest economic expansion in U.S. history. The answer, what are they doing? Well, some have done better than others. And I think some paid heed to warnings around 2020 in terms of, bonds with zero yield are not likely to offer much protection, in the next drawdown. So they reduced their exposure. And we have clients that did just that. They reduced their bond exposure, and then they moved into things like convex tail hedging. Another strategy that's worked reasonably well recently is trend following, which CTAs offer, and that's, we don't think is a substitute for option-based tail hedging because it tends to work well in sort of slow grinding down markets like we saw in 2022. So basically all of these things put together should be considered. We do recognize that, pensions need liquidity, a source of liquidity in bonds, but they shouldn't really over allocate to them, without considering other alternatives.
What do you think is the ideal portfolio construction going into 2024? Because I would imagine it really depends on what phase of life certain investors are in.
Well, specifically back to pensions, they have these return targets of 7%. And if you look at current capital market assumptions, even with bond yields back to 4.5% on the 10-year, it seems it's going to be difficult for them to get that return. Equity markets, while, they've come back, we're still looking at very high valuations, in terms of standard metrics like the cyclically adjusted PE ratio. So, I would argue that, really most investors have no alternative but to stay the course, stay invested in equities, but they can get some, assurance that they're not going to be crushed in the next major drawdown by, as I said, looking at some alternative hedging strategies.
Hey, Ronald, thanks so much for joining us. Fascinating discussion. Ronald Lognato, he is the research director for Immerse, talking about how some of these big funds can and should hedge their equity risk. And I'm just wondering, when you think about some of the pension funds out there, the university endowments, those types of folks.
Right.
I wonder how well they are hedged. To the extent that there's a big decline in the equity markets. But I do know on the university endowment front, they have big exposures to alternative investments.
They do.
30-40% of their portfolio is in hedge funds, private equity, private credit, real estate, commodities, timber, that kind of thing.
Right.
Just an amazing amount of diversification, stuff that's hard to value oftentimes, which a lot of folks will say that is too much risk for some of these endowments. But it's a model that was, I think, really created and perfected by Yale University.
Right, very unique.
Yeah, and it's been adopted by a lot of universities out there. So looking at these markets again, kind of quiet here. S&P 500 up about 0.1%. The NASDAQ up almost 0.2%. Yields coming in pretty sharply here. The 10-year Treasury is off 4 basis points, 4.34% on your 10-year Treasury. With our news in Washington, D.C., here's Nancy Lyons.
Thanks, Paul. Israel's military and the Palestinian militant group Hamas are accusing each other of violating the deal that brought their war to a temporary pause. Israel's military says some of its soldiers were slightly wounded in 3 separate explosions and a shooting in the northern section of the Gaza Strip, while an official with Hamas says a field clash took place after Israeli troops violated the terms of the pause. It's not clear what this means for the 2-day extension of the truce and whether additional hostages and prisoners will be freed. House Oversight Committee Chairman James Comer says he expects Hunter Biden to cooperate with the subpoena for a private deposition on December 13th. His comments come after President Biden's son today offered to testify publicly in response to Republican demands. Comer says in a social media post, Hunter Biden is trying to play by his own rules instead of following the rules required of everyone else. Dignitaries are gathering in Atlanta today to celebrate and remember the late former First Lady, Rosalind Carter. Bloomberg's Jody Schneider says President Biden and First Lady Jill Biden are among those attending.
The Bidens have had a long-time relationship with her, so for them this will be a very personal tribute as well. And we will see other First Ladies there as well. And Jimmy Carter is said to be going to attend this.
That's Bloomberg's Jody Schneider reporting. It has just been confirmed that former President Carter will be there today. He is 99 and has been in hospice care, but a Carter Center official says he had a good night and is well rested. The private ceremony for his wife is being held at Emory University's Glenn Memorial United Methodist Church. Rosalind Carter died last week at the age of 96. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg with the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ remaining in the green. We are off session highs, 7-point gain right now on the S&P 500 index. That is an advance of just about 0.2%. We've got the Dow up 97 right now, higher by about 0.3%. NASDAQ up 28. That is a gain of 0.2%. 10-year yield 4.34% with a 2-year yielding 4.75%. Gold surging $28 the ounce now to 2,042, up 1.4%. We've got Bitcoin up 3% now, 38,133 on Bitcoin. West Texas Intermediate crude rallying as well, up 2.8%, 76.97 for a barrel of WTI. Stocks and bonds extended their November gains. The dollar fell with the latest Fed speak, bolstering speculation that policymakers will have more room to cut rates next year. Howard Ward is director of growth products at Gabelli, and on surveillance this morning, he told us the odds do favor a recession in the first quarter.
Typically recessions come with some headwinds for earnings, headwinds for multiples. And yes, some of the big secular winners, some of that magnificent stuff, those stocks should power through this. The big secular winners will power through it, but they may suffer some multiple compression. But I think overall the market's going to be a little bit sloppy for the next few months until we get clarity on exactly how weak this economy is going to get.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Scotiabank's U.S.-listed shares are trading lower now, down 3.9% after the Canadian bank reported adjusted EPS for the fourth quarter that missed the average analyst estimate. And SpringWorks Therapeutics shares are surging after the FDA approved nirogacestat, the biotech's oral treatment for desmoid tumors. SpringWorks is based in Stamford, Connecticut, and SpringWorks shares up now by 23%. Again, recapping, stocks are higher. S&P now up 6, a gain of 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Powell, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Jess Met and Paul Sweeney here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. I want to get right to our next guest because he's got a couple of picks on his list.
I know that you're
are right
eager
up my
to hear
alley.
about this.
Absolutely. So we're going to talk to our next guest here. And again, some interesting names here. Brian Croes, he's president of Scharf Investments. I'm just looking at his resume. He's been all over the street doing all kinds of stuff. And he's a double Cal Berkeley guy, undergraduate and MBA. I like the loyalty there. All right. Brian, thanks so much for joining us here. I want to get to a couple of names that you like, because in my prior life, I was a media analyst, and I follow a couple of the names that are on your list. Number one is Comcast. Now, when I think about Comcast, I think about their cable business, the video business, that's going to zero. I think about their broadband business. That was such a great driver for so many years, but now they've got competition from the wireless guys. So I'm kind of left with a theme park company. I mean, give us your call on Comcast.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the theme park, because I think most investors kind of forget about that nice crown jewel for them. But, let's talk about the broadband for a second. You got a couple of things going on. I mean, for one thing, they've really been growing their wireless subs tremendously, and I think that's something that people are underappreciating. In terms of the broadband itself, we think while growth has slowed, they had a really big pandemic bounce, but post-pandemic things have been a little bit slower. But we don't think this is really going to be a permanent problem. I mean, ultimately, the fix the wireless trend there's a use case for it, but we think the value of broadband is still there, and it's a very good cash flowing business. We think is going to continue to grow. So we like Comcast a lot, particularly at this valuation. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, continue.
Oh no, I was just going to say, if you look at the wireless business, for example, it's 6 million lines, which is about 10% of their 30 million residential broadband households. So we think that they can continue to grow that, and that's gonna add to the stickiness of your customers, because ultimately, their wireless solution is a lot cheaper, particularly if you bundle it with their home home cable. And interesting enough, your previous spot was talking about Mag 7, which everyone's talking about. But if you look at the leader of the Mag 7, Apple, they're trading about 26 times earnings. If you look at the last 10 years, Apple's grown at about 14%, and interestingly enough, Comcast has grown at about the same rate and is trading about 11 times. So, again, we think you're getting a high quality business with a really sticky moat, at a very reasonable price.
I also see that you worked for Janet Yellen at Berkeley there. So buried in there in the email that you sent us. But tell us a little bit more about that, and how do you view sort of the macro side and what it means for the economy at this point?
Yeah, it was actually Janet Yellen's GSI, before she went to the Fed and before she came, did all the other things she's been doing. In terms of macro, it's very interesting. We've never had a period of time like the last, decade plus where you had basically zero rates. And this has been the fastest increase in interest rates, on an absolute level and a relative level and as a percentage of rates. And so you're seeing a lot of repercussions from that. I would say most people are somewhat surprised how resilient the economy has been. But ultimately, given how fast rates have come up, we think it's likely that there could be a recession going into next year. And actually, even going back a year ago, we said the recession would probably take until 2024, just given how long the lag of Fed policy takes. And so investors should just be, cautious going into next year about being too overly excited about the economy and earnings growth.
Hey, Brian, another name on your list is Disney. And I know there's a lot of just uncertainty around Disney with all the cord cutting affecting their cable networks, particularly ESPN. What do you do with that? And again, this company, this film studio, who knows if those films are still popular, and it kind of another story that kind of comes down to the theme park business. But there's just a lot of uncertainty around a name that a lot of people have liked for a long time, but now there's a lot of uncertainty. How do you guys look at it?
Yeah, I think there's more uncertainty with Disney than, say, Comcast. But with Comcast, with Disney, you get something that nobody else has, which is, you mentioned the theme parks. Not only the theme parks, but their cruises, consumer business. This is really the magic of Disney, and we think that that business alone is probably worth $70 to $80, just the theme parks consumer. And so not that long ago, the stock was trading around that price. If you look at the last quarter, management stated on the call, they said we're moving from fixing mode to growth mode, which is to say they're not quite done with the fixing, but they've made it a big chunk of the way through. And you saw narrowing losses in the DTC streaming business. They added 7 million subscribers. They raised synergy guidance by about $2 billion to $7.5 billion. So we were talking about somewhere around $8 billion of free cash flow next year. And we think that means improved profitability, leverage is coming down. Obviously, they still have challenges in the ESPN business, but we think some of the steps they're taking will ultimately pay dividends. And, in Iger's words, it's inevitable that they're going to launch a streaming service, using ESPN's flagship programming. So we think while the challenges in the ESPN and the traditional media business are still going to take some time to play out, investors can take comfort in having a crown jewel, really the Disney magic, as I mentioned, the parks and the cruises and consumer, and the DTC business, while it's still losing money, is improving. And ultimately, that could be a hugely profitable business that we think gives a lot of upside. So the downside somewhat protected by the parks business, and the upside could be tremendous if that DTC business turns into a big
interesting call. Could prove to be right. There's certainly a lot of assets there and a good management team. Brian Crawes, he is a president of Scharf Investments, joining us here. Again, a double Cal Bear. That's pretty cool. So good stuff there.
Worked for Janet Yellen.
Yes, exactly. Worked for Janet Yellen. All right, looking at these markets here, kind of just really soft here. Not really much here. Only S&P up about 0.1%, giving back some of the gains from earlier today. The Nasdaq's up about 0.1% as well. The yields come in. 10-year Treasury 4.35% on your 10-year Treasury. Gold is higher here this morning. This is Bloomberg. get some company news right now with Lisa Mateo.
You got it, Paul. Roomba maker iRobot is coming off its worst day in nearly 3 years. This is after European regulators expressed concern over Amazon's agreement to buy the company. Bloomberg's Simone Foxman has details.
Brussels issuing a so-called statement of objections, warning that the deal could hurt the overall vacuum market and also that Amazon may demote other vacuum cleaner makers on its platform. This decision, however, puts the EU at odds with the UK, which already gave the green light to the transaction. The US still doesn't have a decision. The FTC has been looking at the deal since September 2022.
iRobot up about 2%. Amazon right now down about 0.5%. Micron Technology under pressure after updating its first quarter sales forecast. We get more on that from Bloomberg's Katie Greifeld.
The memory chip maker says that revenue is expected to approach $4.7 billion. The previous guidance had called for $4.4 billion, give or take $200 million on either side. Meanwhile, you have adjusted losses per share now seen at $1. The previous estimate had been for $1.07. Despite that raised outlook, Micron also said it expects $990 million in adjusted operating expenses. That is well ahead of what analysts had penciled in.
Micron down about 3% right now. To the auto industry, where 3,700 U.S. auto dealers are calling on the Biden administration to ease EV mandates. In a letter to President Joe Biden, the group calling itself EV Voice of the Customer says most U.S. car buyers are not really interested in buying battery electric vehicles, even with the government incentives, and the U.S. shouldn't force them to do so. Those are the company stories we're following. I'm Lisa Mateo. This is...
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller.
Why were the economists so wrong? What are the economists getting wrong?
Isn't this a slam dunk time to buy U.S. Treasuries?
Soft landing, hard landing, no landing. I don't know.
True. What the heck does that mean?
I don't know.
Breaking market news and insight from Bloomberg experts.
We're going to be in an environment with higher rates for longer.
The 5-day in-office work week is effectively dead.
It's definitely a good sign that we're not ready to land this economy just yet.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, a quick look at these markets. S&P up about 0.1%. NASDAQ up about the same in terms of percentages, and the Dow's up about 0.2%. Yields pull back slightly. 10-year Treasury about 4.34% here. The 2 years at 4.75%. So we still have that inversion looking at the 2s and at 10s. WTI crude oil up 2.75%, just under $77 per barrel, and Bitcoin up 3.2%, 38,242. So continued move higher on Bitcoins. We'll keep an eye on that. Let's head down to Washington, D.C. right now. Nancy Lyons has got world and national news for us.
Thanks, Paul. President Biden and First Lady Jill Biden are in Atlanta to attend a tribute service for late former First Lady Rosalynn Carter. Former President Jimmy Carter, her husband of 77 years, is also participating despite being 99 and in hospice care. Other dignitaries who are there include former President Bill Clinton and all the living First Ladies, as well as Vice President Kamala Harris and her husband. Israel says Hamas has violated its truce after some soldiers were injured in explosions and a shooting in Gaza, while the militant group says a field clash took place after Israel violated terms of the agreement without going into any details. Bloomberg's Galit Altstein in Tel Aviv notes this is not the first flare-up since the truce began last week.
We have seen several breaches of the agreement that was reached between Israel and Hamas. Not this kind of breach, but different breaches, and they were contained by both sides.
Bloomberg's Galit Altstein reporting from Tel Aviv. Yesterday, Israel and Hamas agreed to extend the truce for 2 more days following negotiations to release additional hostages. After 2 weeks of rescue efforts, Indian officials say they finally pulled 41 workers out of a collapsed tunnel. When heavy equipment broke down, rescuers had to resort to drilling manually to reach those trapped. Cyber Monday was the biggest shopping day ever, with U.S. consumers spending $12.4 billion. That's up 9.6% from a year ago, according to Adobe, which compiles the data. We get more from Bloomberg's Simone Foxman.
That's even higher than the growth that we saw on Black Friday, 7.5% higher. This overall equates to $38 billion spent through Cyber Week, which started with Black Friday and ended on Cyber Monday.
Again, Bloomberg's Simone Foxman. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. Now back to you, Paul and Jess.
All right, Nancy, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Jess, it seems like the migration to South Florida continues. Now, Amazon.com is looking for office space in Miami as founder Jeff Bezos plans his move from the Seattle area. Amazon is seeking roughly 50,000 square feet of office space. So as Miami has increasingly become a destination for the ultra-wealthy and their companies, demand for office space has boomed. And right now, office availability is now below pre-pandemic levels in 1919. So it's just amazing. This migration, it's not just a beginning of the pandemic thing. It's continuing.
Right. And of course, Ken Griffin actually said this earlier this month where he sees Miami possibly being replacing New York City as the financial capital. But really, do you?
I don't know, but I mean,
Paul, with all your experience, do you really see that happening?
The answer is no, but it's
I feel like it's a
fun
hard
to talk
no,
about.
too.
I mean, there was a time right before Brexit when I may make the argument that London had become the global financial hub vis-a-vis New York, and then the Brits screwed that up with Brexit. So there you go. But I mean, there's no doubting this is a longer-term trend here for wealthy individuals and their companies to continue the migration to Miami or just Florida in general, but particularly Miami for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, my parents are in Orlando.
Oh, nice. There you go. And our own Miami Mike McGlone from Bloomberg Intelligence.
That's right.
He led the charge several years ago, so he was on the cutting edge there.
He was.
All right, sound on with Joe Matthew from Washington, D.C. That starts right now.
from our nation's capital, this is Bloomberg Sound On.
Two major stories that we're following here developing before our eyes.
What does it say about Trump's influence on the Republican Party?
What can the Biden administration do on its own to support Israel?
Bloomberg Sound On. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top names.
The Republican caucus is at war with itself.
Members of Congress would have a press conference every day if somebody would cover that.
There is bipartisan support for Israel.
This is one of the big ones we only see once every decade or 2 decades in the Middle East.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
Israel and Hamas accuse each other of violating the truce. Welcome to the fastest show in politics, as we are reminded today of the fragility of the agreement that has already led to dozens of hostages being released. We'll have the latest straight ahead from our national security team, and we'll explore the political implications for Joe Biden with Cliff Young from Ipsos, out with new data today underscoring the president's problem with inflation. We'll get to Cliff with more on that in just a moment. Nikki Haley moves closer to Charles Cook as her polling improves in New Hampshire, where candidates are busy courting the governor. We'll talk more about that with our panel, Bloomberg Politics contributor Jeannie Shanzano and Republican strategist Lisa Camuso-Miller. It's all after a look at Wall Street. Of course, we start with the markets and an update from Charlie Pellet in New York.
Hi, thank you very much, Joe Matthew. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ. They are all higher. However, we are well off session highs. Right now, we've got the S&P up 3. That is a gain of about 0.1%. Dow Jones Industrial Average up now by 67 points, up by 0.2%. The NASDAQ Composite Index up 19. That is a gain now of 0.1%. 10-year yield 4.33%, with the 2-year that's yielding 4.75%. Surge for gold today, up $27 the ounce to $2,041, up 1.4%. While West Texas Intermediate crude rallying 2.7%, $76.92 a barrel on West Texas Intermediate crude. Cannot ignore Bitcoin, up 3.3% at $38,225 right now on Bitcoin. As for the overall market backdrop and the economic outlook, Cameron Dawson is Chief Investment Officer at New Edge Wealth.
So I think we have to take the cue from the market. If it starts to sniff out that data is weakening, that data is starting to come in where we need to be cutting earnings estimates, we don't hit all-time highs in markets, that's when you'd say maybe recession risk is actually higher.
And you can hear more of the conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Boeing shares flying higher after RBC Capital Markets upgraded the plane maker's stock to outperform from sector perform. We do have Boeing shares advancing today. Right now, we have got shares of Boeing BA on the ticker. Boeing up by $3.75 to $223.05. Also, PG&E says it will pay out a dividend for the first time in about 6 years as part of efforts by the California utility giant to restore its financial health after emerging from bankruptcy. Again, recapping, stocks are higher. Right now, we've got the S&P little changed, actually just turning negative on the S&P as I speak. S&P 500 index down now by 1 point. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, we thank you as always. Welcome to the Tuesday edition of Bloomberg Sound On. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, where I want to start with an update on what's happening here in Israel, which, of course, is taking so much of the president's attention right now. And a pretty important development here as we join you here on the radio, on YouTube, and on the satellite. Israel's military and the Palestinian militant group Hamas are now each accusing one another of violating the truce. Remembering right around this time yesterday, we had breaking news on the extended truce, the extended pause that would bring 2 more days, and at the time, 20 more hostages. There were questions last evening about whether that truce could keep on going, and there are questions now about whether it will see itself through. The IDF, some of its soldiers, were apparently lightly wounded in 3 separate explosions and a shootout that broke out shortly after the northern part of the Gaza Strip. An official from Hamas said a field clash, as they're calling it, took place after Israeli troops violated terms of the ceasefire arrangement without elaborating. And of course, they don't call it a ceasefire. They're calling it a pause or a truce. And we know how fragile it is. And we'll keep you posted on all of this. As the president tries to swing attention to domestic affairs here with an event yesterday geared toward the battle against inflation. This is interesting because Israel is not helping him in the polls. His foreign policy is not, certainly his economic policies are not. Here's the president yesterday at the White House.
Well, this past week, as Americans gathered around their own kitchen tables for Thanksgiving dinner, that was our goal, to give them a little more breathing room. And together, we made progress. You know, from turkey to air travel to tank of gas, costs went down. They went down. Now, to people making a lot of money, that doesn't matter a whole lot because the costs are relatively small compared to wealthy incomes. In fact, as a share of earnings this Thanksgiving, dinner was the fourth cheapest ever on record. I want you all to know that.
But of course, as we've told you here as well, it was still 25% more than it was in 2019. And that is why we find the headline here at Ipsos. Biden's problem is an inflation problem. It's just out today, and Cliff Young, the president of public affairs at Ipsos, joins us to talk about it. Cliff, it's great to have you. Thanks for joining. This is obviously not a new problem for Joe Biden, but you're looking at an approval number in this poll south of 40%, which is pretty close to the lowest that we have seen for him. How does this keep getting worse?
It's inflation, and it's sort of the drag on of inflation. It affects people. Americans in general are surly at this point, especially the younger, the less educated Blacks and Hispanic Americans. And they cite the economy and inflation as the number one issue.
You would think at some point, though, if inflation is easing, following an historic series of interest rate hikes that have created, of course, a whole different problem for consumers. If you look at mortgage rates, if you look at credit cards right now, we've seen an easing in inflation, but his numbers don't seem to be responding to that. Is there a lag effect with this economic condition?
Yeah, first and foremost, there is a lag effect. And when it comes to economics, public opinion typically is a lagging indicator, not a leading indicator. But the other issue is that it's not about rates, Joe. It's about the level of prices, you know. And as you were saying before, things are still more expensive than a few years ago. And Americans feel the pinch. They can't make ends meet. When you look at specific demographics, like younger Americans, they feel that especially so. So yes, there's a lag effect on the one hand, and it's about price levels on the other.
President talking about supply chain yesterday at this event. And they had, of all people, the Secretary of Homeland Security making media rounds to try to make the point. I know they had Pete Buttigieg, the Transportation Secretary, around the Thanksgiving holiday, and everybody gets their turn. But supply chain, Cliff, and maybe you've polled this, is not exactly a household conversation, a kitchen table conversation. Things are either more expensive or they're not. Is the White House just reaching for the wrong narrative?
Yeah, they're trying to connect with Americans. They're trying to explain things, but in a context of that is difficult at this point. Americans are not ready to listen, right? Obviously, supply chain, talking about the supply chain is super abstract, and the average American is not going to understand what it is specifically. But more importantly, people are not willing to listen right now because they're not feeling it.
You write in your piece, what can be done? Need to be patient. The president, I guess, has time on his side here. There's another year for these numbers to improve before people vote. Defend the policy agenda, though, jumps off the page here. If he's going to get above 40% before the election, how does he do that? If it's not supply chain, is it, I feel your pain? What's the approach from the commander-in-chief?
No, I think he needs to be patient. He's going to have to wait. This inflationary inertia is going to have to work itself out in public opinion, and it will. It typically does. And he has to double down on his message, a message of economic growth, a message of economic vitality. Talk about those programs that he's initiated over the last few years. Maybe today people are not willing to listen, but that doesn't mean a half a year from now they won't be.
Is it time to drop the Bidenomics thing? Get rid of this this brand?
Their branding has been suboptimal at best. They need to go and talk about the benefits and the specific, reality that people are living in. That's the best way to connect with anyone, including the American populace.
We're spending time with Cliff Young from Ipsos. Cliff, I know you had run numbers on the president's foreign policy as well, and we're seeing a lot of pushback really from progressives, and in some cases the same people who are being singled out in your new poll on inflation here. It's in many cases people with lower incomes. It's in many cases, people of color who this president needs to get reelected. How much of a problem is that when you add the layer of foreign policy here with what's happening specifically between Israel and Hamas?
Yeah, foreign policy is an important issue. It's not a determinant issue when it comes to the election. Really, once again, if you put inflation versus foreign policy, inflation wins out, and that's tinged in a more negative way. If we look at Ukraine as well, there are weak numbers there. The American populace in general, when it comes to foreign policy, is more isolationist, more inward looking than, let's say, a generation or two ago. Again, the real problem with the numbers is an economic problem, or more specifically, an inflation problem.
Sure. When you add, what some people see as funding violent wars or endless wars, I guess that can have a corrosive effect. Cliff, but there's no doubt about this being an economic issue and something that voters are going to be weighing their decisions on here. I wonder if there's anything more than be patient. If you're essentially saying the president needs to wait for things to get better.
Yeah, it's the economic context. It's difficult. Obviously, they need to double down on their message. They need to be on message. What are those things that they are doing to improve people's lives, whether that be on the economic front or on the healthcare front or transportation or whatever it might be, infrastructure as an example. They need to be patient because the context is more negative at this point. What we know ultimately is that as inflation resides, the numbers probably will tick back up, not to the levels that they were before. It never improves as much as it declines. But yeah, it's a moment to be patient. And one of the points that I was making when it comes to patience is that the Democrats shouldn't overreact. Indeed, a sitting president like Biden, even with the numbers he has better than a 50-50 chance of winning the next election. Maybe it's not 80%, but it's at least 50%, 50-50, let's say. A successor could be Newsom as an example, or Harris as another one, only has about a 6 to 10% chance at the present approval ratings. So once again, be patient. Democrats, be patient. This too will pass the economic context, the negative economic context. And ultimately, this is, the explanation as to Biden's numbers today.
That's great. Cliff Young's message to the Biden re-election team: have patience. This too shall pass. How about in the Republican primary fields? Cliff, I know that's not what you're looking at in these data, but Nikki Haley's sure getting a lot of talk. Larger crowds. Certainly an uptick in polling in New Hampshire, if not Iowa. And I wonder your feel here as we're starting to get close enough that the whole "it's too early" narrative doesn't really seem to be working any longer. Is Donald Trump going to run the board in these early states or not?
It maybe not in the first couple states because they're very controlled elections, Iowa and New Hampshire. But definitely public opinion, more specifically the Republican base, is a Trump base. Really, Nikki Haley is feeling a vacuum left by DeSantis and others. There's no real change. You're changing the names. You're not changing the levels, ultimately. But what we know is that the indictments really didn't have an electoral effect. If anything, they strengthened Trump, and they're really baked into the numbers right now. Obviously, if there's a conviction at one point, could that sway things, perhaps in the general election? But I really think that the favorite, if not the absolute favorite, is Trump at this point, and everything else is kind of rearranging chairs on the deck of the Titanic.
Oh, man, that's just depressing if you're in the race for second. Cliff, it's good to see you. I appreciate the time today. Come back and talk to us again on Bloomberg. Cliff Young, President, Public Affairs at Ipsos, constantly running numbers as we are here at Bloomberg. We'll be talking in another week or two about our next dive on polling from the campaign trail. But I do want to stick with this bead on inflation and the findings from Ipsos as we layer that on top of a very complicated time for this president canceling his trip this week to COP28 to try to deal with what's happening in the war between Israel and Hamas. And to that end, we assembled our panel. With us today, Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, of course, Democratic analyst, Bloomberg politics contributor, joined by Republican strategist Lisa Camuso-Miller, former RNC communications director and host of the Friday Reporter podcast. It's great to see both of you here. Jeannie, your thoughts on what Ipsos is telling us, because it's not the first time. In fact, it's getting to be a little bit of a broken record. Inflation is Joe Biden's problem, and he's out beating the drum on supply chain. If you're trying to get Joe Biden reelected here, do you take Cliff Young's advice and just wait it out?
You know, they have no choice but to wait it out. But in the meantime, I think there needs to be recognition on the part of the administration as to why Americans are in such a sour mood. And they truly are, to Cliff's point and to Ipsos's data and all the data we've talked about. And you look at these 18 to 34-year-olds, this inflation is devastating to their lives. Just look at the issue of anybody who wants a mortgage or wants to rent. This disproportionately impacts young people who didn't have the benefit of getting into the system and buying or renting years ago when they may have got for buyers a lower interest rate. So now they're stuck with this 7-8%. It's devastating to them. So then you flip that over and people say, do you think your children will be better off than you? You're getting numbers like 2 out of 10 Americans only say their children will be better. 73% say we're in the bad direction, misdirection in part of the American public. And so you look at those numbers, and what the administration has to do forcefully is to show it needs to be countered versus what the Republicans are proposing. Things like cutting Social Security, cutting Medicare, cutting Medicaid, giving tax breaks to the wealthy. Yes, we are not perfect, but juxtapose that to the alternative. That alternative is going to be the story for them. They haven't been able to make it yet. And if they don't make it, it's all going to be about them. And those numbers are never going to be as good as they need them to be for Joe Biden.
It certainly reminds us of how important timing is here. You can be the smartest campaign in the world, but his fortunes are going to lie in the trajectory of the economy, whether or not he can affect it, whatever the lag effect is of Fed interest rate hikes, whether we're in a recession or not, the second half of next year, whether he'll be able to take credit for beating inflation. It's pretty tough to plan around that, isn't it?
It absolutely is, Joe. And the thing that I like what Jeannie said about offering them some alternative, but also too, I think the electorate and what we're hearing in the Ipsos poll and a lot of other places that we're seeing sentiment is that people feel unstable. And that's that goes back to your question about whether or not foreign policy plays a role in the election. I don't necessarily think that people go to the polls based on what's happening overseas, but I do think that the unrest overseas, the unrest in the economy, and the unrest in the government is making people feel really concerned about who their leaders are and wanting perhaps a better change and something that's going to give them more stability.
And as we're learning, the lower inflation that the markets celebrate, a lot different than actual deflation that consumers are waiting for. We're going to have a lot more with our panel straight ahead, and the latest from Israel. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 121 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg, and we begin with a developing story. Headline right off of the Bloomberg Professional Service: Lineage Logistics is said to be eyeing an over $30 billion valuation in its IPO. That company, by the way, provides distribution, public and port-centric warehousing, managed transportation, and cold chain solutions. Again, the headline: Lineage said to eye over $30 billion valuation in an IPO. Stocks lower, with the S&P now down 2 points. That is a significant turnaround from our last update in which we had stocks higher. We've got the Dow holding on to a 40-point gain, up by about 0.1%, while the NASDAQ Composite Index is down 10 points, a drop there of just about 0.1%. 10-year yield 4.36%, with the 2-year now yielding 4.76%. Gold up $24 the ounce, now at $2,038, up 1.2%, and West Texas Intermediate crude up 2.5%, $76.77 a barrel on WTI. SpringWorks Therapeutics shares are surging after the FDA approved Neuroglastent. That is the biotech's oral treatment for desmoid tumors. SpringWorks is based in Stamford, Connecticut. Shares up now by 22.5%. Again, recapping, we're looking at a mixed market on this midday Tuesday. S&P now down 2, a drop there of about 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
This is Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
The blame game is underway in Israel today as the IDF and Hamas point fingers at each other, accusing one another of violating this deal, the truce, or pause, as they're calling it, that was extended around this time yesterday. IDF says some of its soldiers were wounded in 3 separate explosions. Hamas says that a field clash took place after Israeli troops violated the terms of the ceasefire without elaborating, and it's difficult to tell without being on the ground what's happening there. We'll keep you posted as we learn more, waiting for the release of additional hostages. That's why, of course, this happened with 11 last evening, and that would mean another 9 due here. If my math is correct, it was 2 more days for 20 hostages. Then brings, of course, the matter of funding for Israel, which has Congress in a bit of a standoff here between the House, the Senate, between even Republicans and other Republicans in the House. The new speaker, though, Mike Johnson, says he has spoken with Chuck Schumer, remembering that they wanted to do Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, the border. And at this point, getting that done by the end of the year seems incredibly unlikely. But here's new Speaker Mike Johnson.
Israel is a top priority for the United States, and supporting our ally there is critical. It's one of the first things we did. In fact, we passed the bipartisan Israel support package out of the House a while ago, right? Not long after I took the gavel, about a month ago. It's been sitting on this in the Senate and on Chuck Schumer's desk. And so we are encouraging him to get that done.
We are encouraging him to get that done, knowing that that House bill can't pass the Senate. And knowing that this really apparently is going to come down to a conversation about border security. Certainly the Ukraine portion will. And if it's all going to move together, there's going to have to be a deal on the border. Spent some time on this yesterday. It's very unclear how that would actually happen. And so we reassemble our panel. Jeannie Shanzano is with us, along with Lisa Camuso-Miller. An important event last evening, Lisa. Senator Tammy Duckworth pulled together a meeting. You probably saw this. To bring in officials from the IDF, including an Israeli major general. Sat them down with Democratic senators who have been very critical of Israel's handling of the war here and the civilian deaths in Gaza. It took place in a room just off the Senate floor, and apparently it was a very frank conversation, according to Brian Schatz. Is that the kind of activity that will accelerate potentially funding for Israel? Or is this all going to lead to a deal, potentially or not, on the border? And that's what this is, in fact, riding on.
Well, I think we have to do everything we can to get this done, Joe. I mean, your point is so right. The end of the year is upon us. It's happening, and they have got to get this done. There is no time to wait. I'm old enough to remember that Congress used to do things, Congress and the Senate, when they worked together. They used to do comprehensive, but comprehensive doesn't seem to work anymore. So I think we need to learn how to walk and chew gum. We need to make sure that we're supporting Israel. We need to make sure that we're introducing people that maybe aren't in favor of giving them more funding, to understand that. Smart on the senator's part to bring them in and to have a conversation about what's happening on the ground. There's a lot of people that have forgotten that long relationship that we have with Israel, and how we have to be supportive of them over and over again, regardless of what they need. They're our biggest ally in the Middle East. We need to continue to do everything we can to support them, but we also need to move quickly in Congress, and we need to stop waiting around and fighting over the airwaves and over the social media platforms. We need to get back to work, and that's something that I think everyone would like to see happen as quickly as possible.
Jeannie, we talked about this idea of tying Israel funding to international humanitarian law. Bernie Sanders out with an op-ed in the New York Times underscoring that. He writes, "I do not support simply giving $14 billion to Israel without any conditions at all." And he's at odds with the Foreign Relations Committee Chair, Ben Cardin, on this. Not a surprise, I guess, to see IDF officials sitting down with senators last evening. Can they change minds like Bernie Sanders?
Yeah, not a surprise, but, really think about the idea that you send over high-level officials at a time when Israel, probably in its history, is in the midst of a crisis, and they take the time to come over and to speak to Democratic senators about funding. I think that shows us how important the debate going on in Congress is, not just in the US, but in Israel. I think, Duckworth, I agree with Lisa, it was the right move. They do need to reassure not just Democratic progressives, but the American public overall. Because, I'm sitting here in New York. The Manhattan Bridge was closed over the holidays due to pro-Palestinian protesters. We had a school in New York where there was a violent riot because a teacher went to a pro-Israeli demonstration. This is the kind of outpouring on the ground we are seeing. This is what progressive Democrats and many others are responding to. And so I think even beyond these Democrats in the Senate and Congress people overall, I think we have an obligation to let the American public know and be reassured that these billions of dollars in aid are not going to go to a use in any country, let alone Israel, that's in violation of law. Now, that said, isn't that the reality of all the aid we give? And if it's not, right, shouldn't it be? Because, a lot of people scratch their head and say, are you telling me we're giving money in violation of international law? No, we are not. So that's another part of this story. So yes, this is critically important, but a lot of this needs to reach beyond Congress and to the ground in the US where we're seeing this demonstration, because it is public money we're talking about.
Well, I do find it incredible, the criticism from both sides of the aisle, actually, that the president is hearing, Lisa. And I wonder your thoughts. I just read the line from Bernie Sanders, and others on the progressive left are very upset with Joe Biden's support of a war that they think has not been careful enough, a strategy on behalf of the Israelis that has not been careful enough to protect civilian lives. We've seen letters written from lawmakers. We've even seen one lawmaker censured on the House floor for what she said about it. Then there's Senator Ted Cruz, for instance, and other Republicans who are bashing Joe Biden for what they say is coddling, for lack of a better term, Iran and not being strong enough on Israel. Here's Ted Cruz last evening on Fox News. Listen to this.
Joe Biden has been the most anti-Israel president the United States has ever had.
There you go.
From the very beginning of the Biden administration, this administration has undermined the government of Israel at every step. They've done so systematically. They've done so at a granular level.
How do you rationalize the criticism from both sides, Lisa? And does it suggest the president might be doing something right?
I'm reflecting on that, but also on something that Jeannie said, and I think it just keeps coming back to the fact that we're so divided in this country that we find ourselves, yes, in a place where if both sides are unhappy, then something good is probably happening here. And that's the difficulty, right? Is that when we're communicating out to our various groups of people that are listening to us, we're communicating to a Republican audience on Fox News, we're contributing to a Democratic audience if we're listening to Bernie Sanders, and both sides of the aisle are really unhappy about what's happening over there. But the truth is that the U.S. has to follow policy and follow history and follow the experts and do what's right. So to me, if that's the case, if the R's are mad and the D's are mad, then the president's probably somewhere in the right spot. But, look, I'm not a foreign policy expert. What I do know is that unrest in the Middle East makes everyone in the U.S. feel uncomfortable. And that's where we come back to the fact that the White House and the administration has a responsibility to communicate out as much as possible through the voice of the president, more than from the voices of other people that maybe audiences aren't listening to. And that's where I think the White House has really made a misstep here and not letting the president talk a little bit more freely and more openly in front of an audience about what it is the White House and the administration has chosen to do so far in this case.
Just a minute to the news here, Jeannie. If the president has Bernie Sanders on one shoulder and Ted Cruz on the other, what does he do in the middle?
Oh, I think he runs away at that point, Joe. That's hardly who you want on either shoulder. But the reality is that the White House feels very good about where they are vis-a-vis this issue. We've got the Secretary of State visiting Israel for the third time. The president has been in close touch with all Israeli officials. And he, as he always says, watch me. We've gotten hostages home, including at least 3 Americans, but many more in this pause. He did get a pause, more humanitarian aid going in, a lot more to do, arguably, but they really do feel that he has had more success in the last 50 days than anybody could have predicted in a very, very difficult situation. And so, let Ted Cruz go on Fox and say whatever he wants. The reality is, watch what has happened on the ground. And it is, the Biden administration that has made this happen. They've been able to work with Qatar and others in making this happen. And they do need to be tough on Iran, no question. But they have seen results in the last several weeks, and they're happy about that, with a lot more to do. Certainly not a success story at this point, but a good start to where we need to be.
Great talk with our panel today. Jeannie and Lisa back with more on the campaign trail next. Another good day for Nikki Haley's campaign, as we'll discuss straight ahead. After we check world and national news, Nancy Lyons does that for us in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. A tribute service is being held this afternoon in Atlanta for late former First Lady Rosalind Carter. Her husband of 77 years, 99-year-old Jimmy Carter, is there despite being under hospice care. Today's guest list includes President Biden and current First Lady Dr. Jill Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, former President Bill Clinton, and former First Ladies Hillary Clinton, Michelle Obama, and Melania Trump. A formal funeral will be held tomorrow in Plains, Georgia. Rosalind Carter passed away at the age of 96 earlier this month. House Republicans are rejecting an offer from Hunter Biden to testify publicly about his business dealings in order to address allegations of wrongdoing. Bloomberg's Billy House has more on the offer that was submitted earlier today by Hunter Biden.
Hunter Biden was subpoenaed to appear for a closed-door deposition by the committee. This is his response to that, and the committee says they're not ready for a public hearing or testimony.
Bloomberg's Billy House reporting. House Oversight Committee Chairman James Comer says Biden is trying to play by his own rules. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got stocks back in the green, barely, with the S&P 500 index up now by 1 point. Little change there. The Dow up 66 points, higher by 0.2%. The Nasdaq Composite Index up now by 2 points, up less than 0.1%. 10-year yield 4.35%, with a 2-year that's yielding 4.76%. Gold up $24 the ounce to $2,038, up 1.2%. While West Texas Intermediate crude oil is advancing 2.3% to $76.58 a barrel. A surge for Bitcoin, up now by 3%, 38,141 now on Bitcoin. Treasuries extended their November rally on growing speculation that the Fed is done with rate hikes and will have room to ease policy next year. Again, the 10-year 4.35%, the 2-year 4.76%. American home prices rose for the 8th straight month, setting a fresh record. And with that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
Detroit, San Diego, New York, and Chicago scored some of the largest increases based on the CoreLogic home price data covering September. Property listings have been scarce in many places, prompting bidding wars. Some overheated markets like Denver saw moderation, though, with the rate on a 30-year fixed mortgage topping 7%. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
Home building shares are lower. Case in point, Toll Brothers down now by 0.9%. Pulte Group, it is trading lower by 0.2%. KB Home down now by 0.6%. Recapping, we've got a 10-year yielding 4.35%. S&P higher, up by 1 point. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
With breaking news on the terminal, this is important as we discuss what's happening today in Israel. An important update as the Israeli government says 12 more hostages, 12 more are turned over to the Red Cross. With the 11 we knew were released last evening, we may have made good here on this latest group, knowing the truce was extended for 2 days, and there is no reason to believe that it cannot be extended again, which is something that we'll be talking about, reminding. Jeannie mentioned this. The Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, on his way to Israel now for trip number 3 since October 7 with this very thing in mind. So we'll keep you posted as we learn more. With news on the campaign trail today as well, and you better believe there's going to be a lot of talk about Israel at the debate that's coming up in just about a week's time, the next debate on the Republican campaign trail. And good news for Nikki Haley. We've talked about this more than once, with surging polling in New Hampshire and a pretty good situation in Iowa as well. There are great hopes that the Haley campaign can seize on something here in the early states, and it appears Charles Koch might be on board, as we report on Bloomberg. A super PAC with close ties to Koch is throwing its support behind Nikki Haley. This is Americans for Prosperity Action, out with a memo announcing their plans today, and we reassemble our panel with their take on what's happening on the campaign trail. Lisa Camuso-Miller and Jeannie Shanzano are with us here. Lisa, how important is this nod for Nikki Haley, just adding to the momentum that we seem to be talking about here on an almost daily basis?
Oh, it's fantastic news for her and her campaign, Joe. And look, the momentum is behind her, and I think that that's been the big race. I think that that's what they and other campaigns have really been working towards now, is figuring out ways to harness that support from those the big supporters that can really make a difference. They can really help them get over the line and build those numbers in a way that they could be competitive with the former president.
The group citing its ground operation specifically in Iowa, Jeannie, which is something that Nikki Haley could use here, where it's really coming down, it seems to be, between Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis once you get beyond the Trump factor here. How important will this be for her in that first state?
Critically important. And I think AFP has some really interesting data we've been hearing about. one point that I think is worth underscoring is about 40% of respondents in Iowa and New Hampshire saying the race hasn't even started yet, which is telling for us because we talk about it every day. So a little bit shocking, but I think it tells you that there's still fluidity there. There's still a time for people to change their minds, to move potentially, if you're Nikki Haley's campaign, away from Donald Trump to Nikki Haley. I think also important, about 3/4 of voters saying they'd be willing to consider somebody besides Trump if they are able to prove that they can beat Joe Biden. In other words, that whole important issue of electability. And that's where I think a lot of the focus is going to have to be. And of course, the polls we've seen prior to this, even nationally or in these swing states from CNN, New York Times, and others, the Bloomberg poll, Morning Consult, and so on, show that there is a way in which Nikki Haley is even more electable than Donald Trump as you look at the numbers as she's put up against Joe Biden. So good news for her there. But, you know, just on the flip side, not so good news. She is still 30 points behind South Carolina, New Hampshire, and Iowa. That's a big number to make up at this point. Nobody's ever made it up in the history. And even in her home state, I'm looking at South Carolina for Real Clear Politics average, 30 points. It's a lot to make up. And with Donald Trump descending in the football games over the weekend, he's cognizant of this and he's going to fight this out.
Yeah, not an accident that he showed up at another football game. Lisa, CNN says that Ken Langone of the co-founder Home Depot is going to be meeting with Nikki Haley. He told the network, two things appeal to me. She's a fighter and she's gaining ground. Whether she can gain enough ground to be a spoiler, who knows? But I thought it was interesting the way he referred to this. He was impressed with her spunk and her reasonable stance on abortion. That's a quote. Now, if you look at Politico today up in New Hampshire, the headline is New Hampshire's most eligible bachelor. That, of course, would be Governor Sununu. And there's a big courting campaign going on right now. Everybody wants to get this endorsement in New Hampshire. Chris Christie certainly put in his time, Lisa. Nikki Haley was in a diner in Londonderry with him asking for his support. Will that be a game changer for these candidates in the Granite State?
I mean, I think it will help, Joe, but this also, too, comes back to Donald Trump. He's invisible on the campaign trail, except for other places other than where they're being called to. So mark my word, the minute Donald Trump actually shows up at a debate, his approval rating will drop. He has been saying some of the craziest things on the trail that have not been getting nearly enough coverage. And the fact that he hasn't stood on the stage with these candidates that are serious about beating him and serious about beating Joe Biden, I think that that's the next thing. That's the next thing we have to hope for, is that he shows up for this next debate. A lot of people inside the Beltway really think that he could show up because this is considered to be a friendly group of hosts. So we'll see what happens. But yes, I think having Governor Sununu would be helpful. He's very popular in the state. They like him very much. I think that would be helpful. But also, too, this is bigger than the usual politics. So the endorsement of the governor may help, but Donald Trump staying in this campaign continues to be an obstacle that every single one of these candidates has to get around.
Well, Jeannie, I know he's busy doing weddings and bar mitzvahs at Mar-a-Lago, but at a certain point, do you offend people when you start skipping the state debates? Like, I mean, if there's going to be a New Hampshire debate the night before primary voters actually go out and pull the lever here, does he not send the wrong message by not showing up, or have you written him off for all of these debates?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, can I say when Ken Langone uses the word spunk, it reminds me of Mary Tyler Moore, wasn't it? Ed Asner, who said she's spunky. So I'm sure that's not what Ken Langone is referencing, but that's me dating myself. And Sununu giving out roses is just too much for me to bear. But, you know, in terms of Trump, I think it is a risk that he runs, but the reality is it hasn't hurt him so far. And I do think that people are thinking very, very specifically, who can, for Republicans, beat Joe Biden? And I do think that they believe the person who can beat him is the one that they're going to get behind. And so if he starts to, you know, falter in these states, he absolutely, to your point and Lisa's point, may show up. Gosh, I hope he does, because it would make these debates much more important than when he's skipping them.
Are you suggesting Chris Sununu is the real golden bachelor?
Oh, you took the words out of my mouth, Joe Matthew.
First thing I could picture here. Jeannie Shanzano, Lisa Camuso-Miller back with some final thoughts here. We haven't talked about George Santos yet or Hunter Biden, both in the news today Nancy Lyons will have headlines on that straight ahead as well. I'm glad you're with us on the fastest show in politics. We'll catch up with Kaylee Lyons for hour 2. Stay right where you are. This is Bloomberg.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Micron Technology suffered its worst stock decline in 2 months, down almost 3% right now after warning that it is spending more than expected on operations. And with more on the story, here's Bloomberg's Tom Busby.
Charlie, Micron is the largest American maker of computer memory semiconductors, and the company raised its outlook for adjusted revenue in the first quarter of the fiscal year to $4.7 billion, from as much as $4.6 billion previously. But the company also said it expects $990 million in adjusted operating expenses, far exceeding analyst expectations. A boost in Micron's forecast, widely expected as demand for chips has picked up. Investors had been looking for a turning point in what has otherwise been a brutal year for the industry. Charlie?
And that's Tom Busby reporting again. Micron on an update for the rest of the market. Micron shares trading lower now by 2.9%. Not just Micron, among other chip names. We do have shares of Intel down now by 0.3%. Advanced Micro Devices, AMD down 0.2%. And NVIDIA shares, they are down now by 1.1%. Barclays has told staff hundreds of back office jobs are at risk as part of its push to reduce costs and boost returns. The British lender informed workers at Barclays Execution Services of 900 potential redundancies. This according to a statement from the union Unite. And those are some of the top company stories that we're following for you at this hour. I'm Charlie Pelletin. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
We are live from Washington, where Kaylee Lyons joins us in just 5 minutes. Thanks for coming along today. We bring you up to date on world and national news now with Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. Rosalind Carter is being memorialized today at a rare gathering of all living U.S. First Ladies and multiple presidents, including her 99-year-old husband, Jimmy Carter. Her son, Chip, addressed those in attendance.
Thank you for coming to help my family and to mourn with my family and mostly to celebrate a life well lived.
The funeral is taking place at Glen Memorial United Methodist Church in Atlanta. Despite accusations from both sides that a truce had been breached, Israel says the latest group of 12 hostages has been released by Hamas, and those hostages have made it into Egypt. Israel is expected to release Palestinian prisoners in return. Embattled New York Representative George Santos says he expects to be booted out of Congress, and this afternoon Congressman Robert Garcia is expected to take the first step toward his expulsion, forcing a vote within 2 days. A House Ethics Committee said it found evidence Santos violated multiple laws. The Republican-led House Oversight Committee is rejecting an offer by Hunter Biden to testify publicly in response to a subpoena for a closed-door deposition. That offer was made by Biden's legal team earlier today, but committee chairman James Comer says they want that closed-door deposition instead on December 13th. The rise in anti-Semitic incidents on college campuses has now sparked a congressional hearing, and the leaders of 3 of the country's most prestigious universities are set to testify.
Harvard President Claudine Gay, the University of Pennsylvania's Liz McGill, and MIT President Sally Kornbluth are all slated to appear next Tuesday before the House Education and Workforce Committee. The panel's Republican chair, Virginia Fox, says there have been countless examples of anti-Semitic demonstrations since the Hamas attack in Israel on October 7th, while college administrators have largely stood by. Alumni, donors, and students at Harvard and other institutions have also criticized campus leadership over these demonstrations. In Washington, I'm Nathan Hager, Bloomberg Radio.
Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. Now back to you, Joe.
All right, Nancy, thank you. You prompted me doing that story about George Santos. I'm looking at a video here of the George Santos balloon that was apparently having a hard time standing up in front of the Capitol because of all the wind today. It's pretty wacky looking. There's a big sign in front of it. Expel Santos. He's full of lies. And that might just happen this week, as we've been reporting here on Bloomberg. That privileged motion that we've been talking about, expected to be filed today, in fact, could be in about 2 minutes' time here, which would set up a vote for any time in the next 2 days to expel the gentleman from New York. Unless, of course, he resigns first. He's called a news conference for 8 a.m. Thursday morning on the Capitol steps, with final thoughts now from our panel, Jeannie Shanzano and Lisa Camuso-Miller. I know you're going to miss him, Jeannie. I still keep asking, though, how's he going to leave? He keeps saying he won't resign, but the Speaker of the House is giving him an opportunity. Is there any chance he steps down at 8 o'clock Thursday morning?
You know, I wish I could believe it when he says he won't, but I think there's a possibility. Right. Joe, why doesn't that balloon say he's full of hot air? That's what I thought you were going to say. And if he goes out, he's going to go out in style, Botox, Hermes. Who knows? He'll look good when he's going out. So it's all exciting, and I will miss him terribly.
Forget the crisis management, Lisa. That's what you actually do for a living. What would you do for fun here for George Santos? How does he capitalize on the moment, get a TV job or get a book deal or something wacky on the steps of the Capitol?
I don't know, Joe. We're living in weird times. I'm sure somebody somewhere would be happy to have someone like Joe Santos on the payroll. But I'm with Jeannie. It's time for the bag of wind to get going.
Man, tough room, I guess. But just wait till it's in the House of Representatives. That could happen, as I mentioned, in the next 2 days here. Big thanks to our panel, Jeannie Shanzano and Lisa Camuso-Miller. I'm going to see if Kaylee can find the balloon. I think it's rolling down Pennsylvania Avenue right now. Hour 2 I should mention on the way next here, an important conversation ahead with Ambassador Mark Ginsburg. You'll only hear it on Sound On. I'm Joe Matthew. Hour 2 starts right now.
Now, from our nation's capital, this is Bloomberg Sound On.
Two major stories that we're following here developing before our eyes.
What does it say about Trump's influence on the Republican Party?
What can the Biden administration do on its own to support Israel?
Bloomberg Sound On. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top name.
The Republican caucus is at war with itself.
Members of Congress would have a press conference every day if somebody would cover them.
There is bipartisan support for Israel.
This is one of the big ones we only see once every decade or 2 decades in the Middle East.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
Israel and Hamas blame each other for violating the truce, but the pause is still intact. Welcome to Hour 2 of Sound On. As skirmishes break out following yesterday's extension of the truce and the release of additional hostages, we'll have the latest on that coming up from Bloomberg and discuss with Mark Ginsburg, the former U.S. ambassador to Morocco. The debate gets real over funding for Israel as well as Ukraine as lawmakers return to the Capitol. The House is back today. We'll discuss that and a lot more with Nathan Dean from Bloomberg Intelligence. And this week could be the end of George Santos' political career. Bloomberg's Billy House will have more from Capitol Hill. Kaylee Lines is on the way in after we check Wall Street. Let's get up to date on trading now in New York with Charlie Pellet. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Joe Matthew. S&P just turning negative. Choppy session, little change, but down a point right now on the S&P. We have got the Dow Jones Industrial Average up 54. That is a gain of 0.1%. NASDAQ up 3 points, higher by just about 0.1%. Treasuries extended their November rally on growing speculation the Fed is done with rate hikes and will have room to ease policy next year. Governor Chris Waller, one of the most hawkish Fed officials, said policy is well positioned to return inflation to the Fed's 2% goal, suggesting policymakers may not need to raise rates again. And Governor Michelle Bowman said she remains willing to support rate hikes if inflation progress stalls, but stopped short of endorsing an increase next month. So a busy day for Fed speakers. Carl Tenenbaum is chief economist at the Northern Trust Company.
One of the reasons why I think the Fed remains cautious, I think it's very hard for them to look forward 6-9 months and feel confident that inflation is going to be at their targeted level. And that's why they have continued not only to stay conservative, but sound conservative.
The next Fed decision will come December 13th. So again, the 10-year 4.33%, 2-year at 4.76%, S&P down 1 point now, the Dow up 59, up 0.2, NASDAQ a little changed as well. Crude oil, West Texas Intermediate up 2.2%, 76.53 a barrel, and gold up 1.3%, 2,039 now on gold. Cannot ignore Bitcoin up 3%, 38,132. A group of auto dealers is calling on the Biden administration to pull back on federal regulations that will mandate that 2 out of every 3 vehicles sold in the U.S. in 2032 will be battery electric. The car dealer group calls itself EV Voice of the Customer. Among EV makers, Tesla shares rallying today by 3.9%. We've got Rivian up 2.7%, Lucid up now by 2%. Recapping, stocks are trading mixed. The S&P turning negative, down now by 1 point. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Charlie, thank you. Welcome to Hour 2 of Sound On. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington alongside Kaylee Lines. And Kaylee, we've got breaking news today from Israel. The headlines keep hitting the terminal here, and it's advanced now to more hostages being released. It looks like another 12.
Yeah, 12. 10 of them Israelis, 2 of them Thai citizens, which may be why the number is above the original 10 that it seemed was agreed as part of this extension of this ceasefire for 2 days. Our expectation is, in addition to the 10 Israelis released today, there will be another 10 released tomorrow. The question then, Joe, is what happens after that? You got the 2-day extension.
Right, exactly.
Is the ceasefire going to be over after that?
Well,
this temporary
we'll be together here at this time tomorrow and trying to answer that very question. In the meantime, it is pretty good news because we woke up to some concern here that the truce might be falling apart with skirmishes that led Israel to blame Hamas, Hamas now to blame Israel for violating terms of the truce, or the pause, as we call it. But it appears to be intact with this next 24-hour period here.
Yeah, the IDF this morning said that there were 3 explosions that targeted Israeli troops in a part of the Gaza Strip that would have been considered under this ceasefire violations without getting necessarily more specific. It does not seem, though, Joe, to your point, that this has led to any further escalation beyond what occurred this morning. And to this point, the truce is still intact. And again, hostages were turned over today.
The truce is intact, and the Secretary of State is on his way. Another important development, Antony Blinken making, I believe, the 3rd trip since October 7th. And it follows this meeting last night in the Senate. I'm fascinated by this, and I want to ask the ambassador about it. Tammy Duckworth put this together with senior officials from the IDF in a room with Democratic senators who've been critical of the way Israel has been conducting the war. They crossed the ocean in the middle of a war to talk to senators here in Washington about this funding battle. And that's where we start our conversation with the ambassador. Former U.S. ambassador to Morocco, and you've heard him with us here on Sound On. Mark Ginsburg, it's great to see you. Welcome back. Is that the right way to do this, to have military officials in a room with politicians here in Washington? Does that make you feel comfortable? And might it unlock a funding deal?
Indeed, that's the expectation that it will. But the issue here is that there's been increasing calls by more progressive members of the Senate, as well as in the House, to condition aid, Israel aid, on extending a ceasefire into a more durable ceasefire. So obviously, Israel's government is deeply concerned about the fact, because all of these calls for a ceasefire, which would in addition condition additional assistance to Israel, is going to put a damper on Israel's ability to have the support it needs from the Biden administration to continue to eradicate Hamas's leadership. And how you thread that needle between extending a ceasefire and having Hamas decimated is really one of the unanswered questions.
Well, Ambassador, to that exact point, if you're the Israeli military right now, how long strategically can you allow this truce to extend before it really works against the objective you are trying to achieve?
Well, that's, of course, the greatest question that anyone can ask right now. And I mean that without patronizing you, Kaylee. But how does Israel eradicate 45,000 hardcore Hamas fighters that are now either sheltered in their tunnels in the northern part of the Strip, or have taken refuge behind the human shields of Gazans who have fled to the south? And how do you do that in a way that doesn't cause what we would call in the military collateral damage to civilians? I mean, that's a question that the Israeli military, I don't think, has a good answer to.
Well, so what's it going to look like then, assuming this truce comes to an end tomorrow, days or even weeks from now? What's it going to look like when that first salvo is fired into Gaza, when the first tanks roll in, the first explosions? The PR battle is going to start getting a lot more difficult for Benjamin Netanyahu, will it not?
It'll not only be difficult for Netanyahu, but it'll be far more difficult for the Biden administration to continue to provide unbridled support for Israel, even though its spokesman, including the National Security Advisor, just said this Sunday that Israel has every right to do what is necessary to decimate Hamas as a threat to Israel. But let's try to put this a bit more in some perspective. Bill Burns, the CIA director, is in Qatar right now to try to negotiate an extension of the ceasefire with Israeli counterpart, as well as with the Egyptians. Why? In order to facilitate more aid. Why? Because the Israelis don't have a good end game that they can share with the United States. And number three, Hamas, to all what we've been able to see so far, has only lost several thousand out of the 45,000 hardcore terrorists that are a part of the organization and its collateral terrorist organizations in Gaza.
Well, to your point on the conversations that were happening in Doha, it's the U.S. involved here and Egypt and Qatar. Do any of them have enough leverage over either the Israelis or Hamas to push for a continued ceasefire? Or ultimately, is this going to be up to these two groups? I just wonder how those kind of conversations are going with the other countries that are involved here.
Well, let's just assume for the record that Hamas wants as many ceasefire extensions as possible and dribble out as few hostages as possible. On the contrary, Israel wants its hostages back and is prepared probably to see if Hamas will release more hostages in a way that gives the Israeli public what it wants, which is at least an end to the hostage side of this equation. And I don't think that the Israeli military is sitting anxious to pull the trigger again at this point until they're able to figure out an end strategy once any ceasefire or durable extension of the current pauses comes to an end. We're playing, in effect, almost an hourly game here.
Ambassador Cayley asked you about Hamas's ability to rebuild and regroup in the middle of a pause like this. How about on the other side? How long can the IDF reasonably remain crouched if days or even weeks go by and still be ready?
I'm not worried about the IDF being ready. The incentive for the IDF and the 120,000 reservists have been called up is they're itching to get back into this fight. I'm not worried about it. What I'm more concerned about is the impact on Israel's economy. Israel was humming along until October 7th. And when you pull that many people out of the economy, that begins to have a significant impact on Israel's budget and as well as, I guess, domestic morale. But let's also not forget that there's another front in the north that is sapping Israel's energy as well. And as long as the conflict with Gaza continues, Israel faces an enormous challenge in the north, which, after all, is the real threat for a broader conflict, and that is between Hezbollah, Iran on the one hand, and the United States and Israel on the other.
Ambassador, I'm glad you brought that up because, as Joe mentioned, Secretary of State Antony Blinken is going to make another trip to the region. And in addition to expressing U.S. support for Israel, in addition to pushing for greater humanitarian relief, we do expect that a lot of his effort is going to be focused on preventing this conflict from expanding any further. How great do you think the risk is right now of this becoming wider regionally?
I think it's already pretty wide. The fact is that although Hezbollah and Israel have in effect respected what is taking place in Gaza, and so there's been somewhat of a truce between Hezbollah and Israel. Hezbollah's leader has made it very clear that as long as there are hostilities that are continuing in Gaza, Hezbollah will continue to do what it can to divert IDF attention away to, in effect, make Israel's life and the Israeli population's life in the north miserable, as well as Israel doing the same for southern Lebanon. You have a massive dislocation now on both sides of the border of inhabitants that have lived on both sides of the border as a result of the fear factor that it's at work, that at any hour, at any day, there can be a significant resumption of hostilities between Israel on the one hand and Hezbollah on the other.
Well, we've talked about Antony Blinken. You mentioned Bill Burns. How about Joe Biden? Does he go back?
I don't think so at this point in time. I think the president at this point in time has made it very clear that he too is trying to figure out how does he maintain this outright support that is in his heart and soul for Israel's need to protect itself against the pressure and his own understandable own concern that he has for the fate of Gazans who are victimized by Hamas's terrorist imprisonment of citizens inside Gaza. You can't hold all Gazans responsible for Hamas, notwithstanding the fact that they did elect Hamas in the first place.
Well, and that again comes back to the humanitarian concern. We just got a headline out from the Pentagon that the U.S. has airlifted 54,000 pounds of relief supplies for Gaza. And yet we've heard consistently in recent days, Ambassador, that it's nowhere near enough. How close are we to an inflection point where the tide of public sentiment turns in a more material way, given the extent of the humanitarian crisis we are seeing in Gaza?
Listen, I think in the end that most Americans, and by far the polls show that, support Israel's right to defend itself. And I don't think that, notwithstanding all of the demonstrations that have taken place and garnered publicity here, and the expressions of concern on the White House staff, that Americans are prepared to throw in the towel. Congress so far has seemed willing to give bipartisan support to Israel and not condition aid. There's always going to be a few fringe senators, whether they be Bernie Sanders or Chris Murphy, or even my senator from Maryland, Chris Van Hollen, who seem to be far more concerned. But I ask you the following question. If they're more concerned than the Palestinians on the West Bank, what does that say a lot to you? It says a lot to me.
I want to get your reflections before you leave us, Ambassador, about what's happening today in Atlanta. For folks who don't know, you started your career essentially as a diplomat in the Carter administration. And we've got the President and First Lady in Atlanta today. We've got every living First Lady gathering as well to say farewell to Rosalind Carter. And I'm wondering what we should know, what people should know about the legacy that the Carter administration left in terms of establishing ties in the Middle East.
Well, I worked on this issue almost for 3.5 years during the Carter administration as deputy advisor to the president for Middle East policy. And I had the privilege of speaking with Rosalind and the president when I was ambassador to Morocco, and they came and stayed with me to reflect on this period of time, because he was truly dedicated to trying to forge more than just a peace between Egypt and Israel in the Camp David negotiations. But he came across the same type of a government in Israel that currently exists right now, a right-wing government led by Menachem Begin, who was determined to prevent President Carter from fulfilling his aspirations to bring about a first stage autonomy for Palestinians, which we all believed in, and then secondly, to help produce a Palestinian two-state solution with Israel. The right-wing government in Israel would have nothing of it, and as a result, there was an enormous amount of friction that developed between what essentially should have been closer ties between President Carter and Israel because of his enduring commitment to peace between Israel and Egypt, thanks, of course, to President Sadat.
It's good to have you back, Ambassador. He's now president of Coalition for a Safer Web. Maybe we'll talk cybersecurity next time, because that's actually a pretty big part of all of this. Mark Ginsburg, the former U.S. ambassador to Morocco, sharing insights with us today on Sound On. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons. We're balancing both sides of this story, what's happening in Israel and here in Washington, where the debate surrounding funding is about to get real. Lawmakers back in town today in the House, and we'll have more on that next. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Little change right now on the S&P 500 index. It has been swinging between gains and losses, right now up by half a point. Unchanged on the day. We've got the Dow up 72 points. That is a gain right now of 0.2%, while the NASDAQ 100 index also little changed, up less than 0.1%. The NASDAQ Composite Index up by just about 0.03%. We've got the 10-year yielding 4.34%, the 2-year 4.75%, spot gold up $26 the ounce, up 1.3%, and West Texas Intermediate crude up 2.3%, 76.56 a barrel, Bitcoin up 3%, 38,127. SpringWorks Therapeutic shares are surging after the FDA approved nirogacestat, which is the biotech's oral treatment for desmoid tumors. SpringWorks, based in Stamford, Connecticut, and SpringWorks shares, they are surging by 18.1%. Again, recapping, a half-point drop now in the S&P 500 index. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, they're back. Just don't ask us what's going to happen with a long to-do list. Members of the House returned to Washington now that they have digested their turkey and done what they were going to do over the weekend here. The Senate was already in place, so we actually could see some things happen in the next couple of days. I'm Joe Matthew along with Kaylee Lyons. I guess technically we did see something happen.
We did, about 20 minutes ago.
I'm remiss that I haven't mentioned this yet. So Robert Garcia does the duty.
The Democrat from California.
Interesting.
Yeah.
The chair of the Ethics Committee brought a resolution.
I rise to give notice of my intent to raise a question of the privileges of the House. The form of the resolution is as follows. House Resolution 114, resolved that pursuant to Article 1, Section 5, Clause 2 of the Constitution of the United States, Representative George Santos be, and he hereby is, expelled from the House of Representatives. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
There it is.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whereas, he's going to be holding now, again, that sets a 48-hour clock.
Correct.
You could do it now, anytime in that time frame. There's an 8 a.m. news conference. Why did he do it so early on Thursday on the Capitol steps? Maybe he doesn't even show up, but that's going to be the plan for George Santos.
Well, he had to be thinking math-wise.
You think he actually
Congress
worked that out?
Tuesday. If they make it privileged, 48 hours. So if I'm going to get out front of it, I have to do it Thursday morning? Or it was just random. I mean, there's that possibility, too.
It could be, but you tend to think the Speaker, who talked to him this week, we discussed that. In fact, I can play you what he said about it. Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House here, on George Santos.
It remains to be seen. I've spoken to Congressman Santos at some length over the holiday and talked with him about his options, but we'll have to see. It's not yet determined, but we'll be talking about that when we get back tomorrow.
So they're going to give him enough time to resign on Thursday morning, I'm guessing, instead of bringing this to a vote tomorrow. He says he won't, which makes me think he will. But I don't know, Kaylee. That happening today. Also, we got big news. Just in the last hour, 12 more hostages released. The news from Israel continues to flow here. So nice to see that. The question is, what'll be the story this time tomorrow?
Well, absolutely. You have a 2-day extension of this truce agreement. It was 10 more hostages set to be released today. They got 12, 10 of them Israelis, 2 of them Thai nationals. And then, in theory, you will get roughly the same amount tomorrow. But what happens after that, anyone's guess. And that's just looking at the actual conflict abroad. There is also the domestic question, now that the House is back, is what kind of funding arrangement for Israel or anything else are we going to get out of this Congress?
Well, that's absolutely right. That's where we bring in Nathan Dean for our weekly conversation. He is dad here on Sound On and brings the voice of reason from Bloomberg Intelligence. His real title is Washington Senior Policy Analyst, right? Yeah, Dad will work. I think it's great to see. I hope you had a great Thanksgiving. Does this news, when you start seeing hostages released, when you start hearing about progress in talks in Israel, do anything to impact the debate here
So I think the debate here is more focused on domestic issues like the border security. We've seen lots of negotiations in the Senate ongoing as we speak. We've seen statements from Chuck Schumer that, border security, that they recognize that border security may have to be part of a Ukraine deal. But what we're telling our clients at the moment is the Ukraine aspect is more important from an impact on defense contractors than the Israeli component. President Biden said, his $106 billion package, 43 plus billion for Ukraine. My colleague Will Lee put a note on the terminal. You're looking at 1 to 2 percentage points in additional revenue gain for those defense contractors. So that's what we're looking for, is whether the Ukraine piece moves forward or not. Now, from the political angle, this all has to move together because you're not going to get any of this by piecemeal. Right. And when that happens, it could happen next week. It could happen in 2024. We're just going to have to see how negotiations play out.
You running odds on this?
No, we're not running. We're not running odds on this one just because. This is the highest priority before we get to the January government shutdown. And as we've said before, we think there's a high priority for a shutdown at the first date of January 19th.
High probability.
Yeah, exactly. High probability. But for the Ukraine-Israeli aid, there's general consensus. This needs to get done. I think they're just trying to figure out exactly what it's going to look like.
There's a lot there. Does BI ever do like a retreat in Las Vegas? If you're running odds on this stuff, I feel like I'd like to go to Las Vegas with you if we can maybe work that out at some point.
Road trip with Dad.
Road trip with Dad, exactly. It could be like a serious moneymaker. I think that's a client event if I ever heard of one. We are clients. More where this came from, though. Government funding, we've talked about Israel, Ukraine, and a border deal. When you're talking about immigration reform and changing asylum law, if you were running odds on this, I'm guessing it wouldn't be very high. This is something that has eluded Congress for a generation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's easier said than done, right? What we're looking for at this point in terms of whether or not deals move forward is language, are you still open to negotiations? Nobody has shut the door on anything just yet. Yeah. Even the president has said that he's not putting out a firm red line on anything at the moment. So as long as those negotiations keep continuing, we should take an optimistic view on this. Now, between now and the end of the year, also remember the FAA reauthorization has to get done. So Congress does have to do something, more likely than not kicks the can down the road, but still, you still have to do something. And eventually, policymakers are going to say, it's mid-December, I want to go home, get me out of here. And that can always be a leverage to push people to come to an agreement as well.
Well, they need to figure out the NDAA as well, the National Defense Authorization. Are we going to see things attached to it, like, I don't know, a crypto bill or a credit card bill?
If we were to give Christmas trees dancing in your head.
If we were to give truth serum to a lot of lawmakers, I think 95% of them are trying to attach something to the NDA at the moment. To your point, Senator Durbin's Credit Card Competition Act, he's tried this before, he'll try it again. I don't think this bill goes anywhere. I actually don't think that you're ever going to get enough support, bipartisan support, to get this bill across the finish line. For crypto, Patrick McHenry certainly may try with his FIT Act, the Financial Innovation Act. We've seen Senator Elizabeth Warren team up with Lindsey Graham on their AML bill. That could get included. But what we're telling our folks when it comes to the NDAA is just, look, this is generally, historically, a bipartisan bill. You don't really attach controversial items to the NDAA. And so, given what we think is going to happen in January with a lot of the conflict and the shutdown threats and so forth, I think the NDAA stays a little small and just passes without much attached to it.
Well, how about we attach something about military promotions? Could Republicans seize on that rule change to force an end to the Tuberville blockade or move a big number of promotions along with the NDAA? Could it be a vehicle for something that's actually quite related like that?
Oh, yeah. Anything can happen. Look, I think outside of Senator Tuberville, there's not many people that are on board with that policy.
Right.
And, we also have an election to think about. Even though we are just over a year or under a year away from the 2024 election, every single member on Congress who's running in next year has already started thinking about that. So don't be surprised if you see some grasps for bipartisanship when and if they show up, because people don't want to be there. Certainly there are a lot of people out there who want to be seen fighting and shutting government down and so forth like that. But there are people out there that says, look, I came to Washington, came to get stuff done. Let's get some stuff done. But
yeah, well, and some of the stuff they're getting done, if they can't actually get bills passed, is at least holding hearings and getting to do the performing. This time next week, you know what we're going to be talking to Nathan Dean about?
I can't wait.
All the big bank CEOs in Senate banking, December 6th.
Fun. You're going to be up there for that, I'm guessing, right?
Oh, yeah. Can't wait. Also, on the same day, Mark Zuckerberg and a bunch of social media CEOs are going to be in the judiciary. It's going to be a big day on the Hill. But for the banks, Nathan, what are you going to be watching?
It's the Basel III endgame. It is always the
I knew
Basel
he
III
would say
endgame.
that. I teed that up just so we would work it into this program.
If anybody watched the New York Jets this weekend, first, I'm sorry. But second, there was a commercial because the bank trade associations are trying everything to stop the Basel III endgame from getting implemented. And the Fed, in my words, is being on extremely thin ice right now. They're trying to search for what I call like the Goldilocks rule, the rule that makes the moderate Democrats happy, also makes the progressives happy, and they can get it through without being sued over an APA violation. We saw a statement from the Goldman CEO, David Solomon, this morning about he was concerned about the cost-benefit analysis. In my words, I'm concerned about this rule is not going to stand up to legal muster, and AKA Fed, when you read my comment, please note, we're looking at this to make sure it's going to, not pass to the courts. So I think we're going to see the Jamie Dimon show. He likes to dominate these hearings. But again, it's all coming down to the Basel III endgame.
This will be fun. This is like Kaylee going to a concert. Like yours playing next week, they're all in the same hearing. It's like a double bill. Let us know when Thanos finally brings the end game. That is something that I'm still waiting for. It's great to see you, as always. Nathan Dean. Find him on your terminal. You're a client, too. That's the best part of all of this. He's also your dad, if you want. At Bloomberg Intelligence, with great insights every week here on Sound On. I'm Joe Matthew, along with Kaylee Lyons. I want to bring you up to date. We've had a lot of breaking news today, as we mentioned earlier. World and national headlines now with Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. Dignitaries are gathered in Atlanta today to celebrate and remember the late former First Lady Rosalind Carter. Even her husband of 77 years, former President Carter, made it despite being in hospice care. Her son, Chip Carter, was among the speakers.
She told me that when Dad started running for president, that the thing that she enjoyed the most were the people that she met across the country.
Rosalind Carter died last week at the age of 96. Hamas has turned over 12 more hostages, 10 Israelis, 2 Thai citizens, to the Red Cross. That's according to the Israeli Prime Minister's office. Earlier in the day, there were questions about the truce after both sides claimed the other had violated the terms. House Oversight Committee Chairman James Comer says he expects Hunter Biden to cooperate with the subpoena for a private deposition on December 13th. His comments come after President Biden's son today offered to testify publicly in response to Republican demands. Already serving time for murder, disgraced South Carolina attorney Alec Murdaugh is being sentenced for stealing from his clients. He pleaded guilty to stealing more than $12 million from his clients and his law firm over 10 years.
I agree that I wrongly took all of that money, Your Honor, and did all of those crimes.
State prosecutors and Murdaugh's attorneys negotiated a 27-year prison sentence for these crimes. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. Choppy session. We have got the S&P 500 index fluctuating right now. It is higher by just about half a point. The Dow holding on to a gain of 86 points now, up by about 0.3%, while the Nasdaq Composite Index is higher by 9, up by about 0.1%. Treasuries extended their November rally on speculation the Fed is done with rate hikes and will have room to ease policy next year. 10-year now yielding 4.34%, the 2-year 4.74%. Gold surging $27 the ounce, now at $20.40. That is a gain of 1.3%. West Texas Intermediate crude up 2.1%, $76.45 a barrel. Meanwhile, Bitcoin with a 38,000 handle. Bitcoin up 3.1% right now, 38,197. The Conference Board reports its Consumer Confidence Index advanced for the first time in 4 months. And with that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
November's confidence data show Americans took a more optimistic view of the labor market and see less chance of a recession over the next year. They're also betting inflation will ease and U.S. interest rates will fall. Moreover, the share of Americans expecting to buy a car, a home, or a major appliance is up. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
Well, let's talk retail. Shoppers spent $12.4 billion on Cyber Monday, a record result demonstrating the continued resilience of consumers despite dwindling pandemic-era savings and high rates. We get those numbers from Adobe, which compiles the data. Among online retailers, we did see shares of Amazon today down 0.6%. Among some of the other retailers, Macy's down 0.3%. Target shares today higher by just about 0.2%. Again, recapping, we've got stocks higher, little change. That's the key takeaway right now, with the S&P up by 1 point. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
We have a new countdown clock to keep our eyes on here, and that one is leading up to an expulsion vote for George Santos. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington. Kaylee, the official procedural matter has taken place. A privilege resolution brought to the floor a short time ago was actually just the beginning of this hour. And so we get 48 hours basically to figure out the next move. It's on the speaker now.
Right, and I'm not exactly sure if Mike Johnson has said where he is coming down on this, when he wants to actually bring this thing to a vote, but it seems like we know where this vote is going to head, whenever it happens. Even George Santos himself in his Spaces
rant?
Yeah, looking for a word here. Very long
broadcast
on Spaces over the holiday weekend. He basically said, yeah, I know how this vote's going to go, and it's not going to go in his favor, it seems.
Well, yeah, I guess that's right. So we're kind of wondering when this is going to happen. Billy House, I understand, was in the House chamber when this took place.
Indeed.
Earlier today, and he's
Billy
with us
in
right
the House.
now. Billy in the House, reporting for Bloomberg, of course. It's great to see you, sir. Welcome back as he brings us into, look at this. If you're with us on YouTube, this is the real thing. This is how business is done and where it happens in the House of Representatives. And Billy, we know that George Santos has a news conference set for 8 a.m. Thursday morning. Does this happen before then?
Well, because of Robert Garcia, a Democrat from California's triggering of his old resolution that was tabled in May, something has to happen by Thursday night, within 2 days. So the vote could occur tomorrow or it could occur Thursday, depending on what Speaker Mike Johnson decides, and he hasn't said anything. And of course, there's a parallel Republican resolution, but the sponsor of that measure, Representative Guest of Texas, the Health Ethics Committee chair, has not acted on his yet. So we expect